Victorian England didn't need marching soldiers on every street corner to remind people who was in charge. Power didn't roar. It whispered, nodded, hovered in the background, and settled into the national consciousness like fog rolling through London's alleys. The Crown was not merely a political structure. It was a presence, a landscape feature, something you lived inside whether you acknowledged it or not. It lingered in every post office, schoolroom, courtroom and train station, glancing at you from endless portraits as if to say, "Behave, we're watching, but politely." Before we step into Victorian times when the British Crown quietly shaped everyday life, take a moment to like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time of day you're hearing this story unfold. Now let's begin. For most Victorians, the monarchy wasn't something distant or abstract. It was instead the backdrop of daily life, the official wallpaper of the British Empire. A portrait of Queen Victoria often hung exactly where your eyes would land the moment you entered a public building. You didn't have to meet the Queen. She was already peering at you from a gilt frame above the fireplace. Even people who never travelled farther than their local market were reminded formally and consistently that they lived under her reign. It was like having a landlord you never actually met, yet whose face appeared in every room of your house, including the pantry. This omnipresence wasn't accidental. The Victorian era saw a boom in printed images thanks to technological advances like lithography and photography, and no one benefited from being endlessly reproduced more than Queen Victoria. Her face travelled farther than most citizens ever would, crossing oceans, appearing in colonial administration buildings, railway stations, military outposts, and even humble village schools. Her image was the empire's most reliable export, cheaper than tea, less controversial than gunpowder, and far easier to ship than stubborn bureaucrats. But the Crown's presence wasn't limited to physical portraits. It also lived inside the rituals of daily life. Coins jingling in pockets carried her profile. Stamps bore her silhouette, so every letter someone sent, whether it was a heartfelt confession or an angry note about chickens eating the neighbour's cabbage, began with a tiny royal nod of approval. Even the newspapers printed the movements of the monarchy with religious consistency, where they dined, whom they greeted, what charities they supported. Reading about the Queen's daily schedule became a national pastime. In many ways, the early Victorian press functioned like a slow-moving, gentlemanly social media feed. Queen Victoria seen walking in the garden today. Victorian England didn't scroll, it flipped pages. This constant visibility wasn't meant to impose fear, but to cultivate familiarity. Strategic, carefully managed familiarity. The monarchy knew that people were more likely to obey an institution that felt stable, ever-present, and quietly involved in their lives. Not breathing down your neck involved, but sitting in the corner with a teacup involved. It was soft surveillance, Victorian style. The Crown didn't need to check on you. It simply placed a portrait where you would check on yourself. Even ceremonies reinforced this atmosphere. Royal jubilees, processions and celebrations stitched the monarchy into the very fabric of public life. Towns decorated themselves in banners, flags, and decorative portraits until even the lampposts looked loyal. People who rarely thought about politics suddenly found themselves cheering in the street because, well, everyone else was. The monarchy excelled at creating moments where loyalty felt less like obligation and more like community participation, like joining a neighbourhood barbecue, except the host was your ruler and the food was as symbolic. And then there were the buildings. Architecture itself became a physical reminder of Crown authority. Government offices bore the royal coat of arms over their doors, reminding citizens that they were entering spaces not simply run for them, but run on behalf of the Crown. Courthouses showcased the lion and the unicorn so prominently they looked like they were auditioning for the world's sternest circus. Even prisons featured royal emblems, as if to say, you may have broken the law, but don't forget who owns this place. The postal system, meanwhile, became a slow-moving royal messenger service. Every red mailbox carried the royal cipher, telling you exactly whose system you were participating in. Dropping a letter inside wasn't just communication, it was obedience wrapped in an envelope. You could write anything you wanted in your letter, but the box reminded you who technically delivered it. Even rebellion had to go through royal channels. All of this created a particular psychological effect. The crown felt stable, omnipresent, and gently supervising. Not in a "we're monitoring your breakfast choices" way. Victorian breakfast already had problems, but in a "you live in a larger system, don't forget it" way. People didn't consciously think about this presence every minute, but it shaped how they viewed their world. To be Victorian was to move through a landscape curated by the monarchy, where even mundane tasks like buying bread or mailing a letter occurred under the quiet, dignified gaze of authority. And that's the heart of Victorian control. The monarchy didn't need to flex its power. It only needed to exist everywhere at once. The crown was the room's quietest guest and the one everyone tried hardest to impress. That's why the era could feel orderly even when the streets were filled with factory smoke, pickpockets, and questionable medical advice. The Queen wasn't solving your problems, but she was watching, from the wallpaper while you attempted to solve them yourself. You didn't meet the crown, you simply lived under it, quite literally at times, stitched into your walls, your coins, your newspapers, and your idea of normal life. Victorian England was not simply governed by laws, it was upholstered with them. They filled corners, lined hallways, settled into routines, and occupied the home as densely as heavy mahogany furniture. Laws didn't appear as thunderous royal pronouncements. Instead, they slid quietly into daily life until bumping into one felt as natural and as unavoidable as stubbing your toe on the dining table in the dark. You didn't set out to challenge authority, you simply existed near it, and that was often enough. To understand just how embedded these laws became, you have to picture a society that was rapidly industrializing, urbanizing, and expanding. Change arrived faster than Victorian polite society could drink its tea, which, by the way, was alarmingly fast. With new factories, new cities, and new social problems came a tidal wave of new legislation. Everything needed rules: work, transportation, property, sanitation, commerce, public behaviour, even how people interacted in the street. The Victorians didn't just build a modern state, they built an entire rule book around it. The way over-enthusiastic hosts arrange the house before company arrives, meticulously, anxiously, and with more items than anyone realistically needs. What made Victorian law unique wasn't simply its quantity, but its omnipresence. These laws were not dramatic pronouncements shouted from balconies. They were woven into ordinary routines, the legal equivalent of wallpaper patterns people stopped noticing. They governed where you could walk, how you could trade, what you could sell, when you could work, who could run a shop, and whether your chimney could emit smoke suspiciously thick enough to alarm the neighbours. No one was free from rules, because rules existed to ensure that no one could be free from them. Take street regulations. Victorian towns were growing faster than planners could anticipate, and chaos, actual, physical chaos, was a daily hazard. Laws tried to tame it. You couldn't block a pavement. You couldn't let your wagon stand in the wrong location. You couldn't let animals wander freely unless you were prepared to argue with annoyed constables who had opinions about goat placement. And if your chimney smoke drifted improperly, or your rubbish lingered in the road, congratulations. You had just committed a legal offence. Not intentionally, of course, but intention mattered far less than the fact that the law happened to be sitting there, waiting for someone to collide with it. Even owning property required navigating a labyrinth of regulations. Land transfer, inheritance, tenancy, maintenance, drainage. Each element came with instructions so extensive that buying a house felt less like acquiring shelter and more like entering a long-term agreement with the rules themselves. Property law created a strange sense of partnership between citizens and legislation. You owned the home, but the laws owned the relationship. If something went wrong, it was often easier to move than to fight the legal furniture bolted to your living arrangements. Commerce was no refuge either. Running a business meant complying with a list of regulations long enough to function as its own novella. You needed licenses, inspections, approvals, and occasionally a tolerance for officials appearing at inconvenient hours with clipboards overflowing with questions. Market rules dictated what could be sold, where it could be sold, and whether the person selling it was trustworthy enough not to poison half the neighbourhood. The laws weren't trying to be dramatic. They were just always there, quietly tapping you on the shoulder to remind you who really ran the room. But perhaps the most subtle mechanism of control came from the expanding legal language that categorized everyday behaviour. Vagrancy laws, loitering rules, public order acts. These weren't designed to handle grand crimes. They existed to shape behaviour gently but firmly. Standing in the wrong place could be interpreted as intent. Walking suspiciously slowly might get you questioned. Gathering with too many friends, especially if they all looked like they had opinions, became a legally interesting activity. The law was not merely a boundary. It was a companion, trailing along like an anxious chaperone at a Victorian dance. And the strangest part? Much of this felt normal. Victorian England's legal landscape grew gradually, piece by piece, until people assumed that the rules had always been there. Laws became invisible not because they were absent, but because they became second nature. No one questioned why certain acts required permission. They simply followed protocol. No one asked why regulations existed. They navigated around them like furniture that had always occupied the hallway, too large and too established to move. This invisibility was precisely what made the laws powerful. The Crown didn't need to send soldiers marching through the streets when it could rely on invisible walls woven into daily life. Legislation shaped habits. Habits shaped expectations. Expectations shaped culture. When rules become normal enough, they don't feel like rules at all. They feel like life. That was Victorian control. Subtle, persistent, and remarkably effective. You weren't resisting authority because it never announced itself loudly enough to be resisted. It simply existed in the corners of your world, built into the routines you followed without thinking. You didn't break the law. You bumped into it, accidentally, frequently, and in ways that made it clear who had arranged the room. Victorian England was many things: industrial, ambitious, smoky, but above all else it was organised, or at least it tried very hard to be. The Crown began developing a fascination with information so intense it bordered on romantic. If Victorians breathed, the government wanted a record of it. If they moved houses, the government wanted 2 copies. If they were born, married, or died, the government wanted it notarized, stamped, logged, indexed, cross-referenced, alphabetized, and filed so carefully that even the angels would have trouble misplacing the paperwork. This obsession wasn't simply administrative curiosity. It was a new form of control. Because once a government knows who you are, where you are, what you do, and who you live with, it no longer needs to guess how society works. It can measure it, map it, and, most importantly, manage it. Victorians quickly learned that the state didn't just want citizens, it wanted data. Birth registration was one of the earlier signs of this shift. Before the Victorian era, many births were recorded informally by churches, often in handwriting so chaotic it resembled the notes of someone writing during a small earthquake. But the Crown wanted accuracy, names spelled consistently, dates written legibly, identities confirmed beyond "we think this is Mary." Thus, the system of civil registration was born. Life's most intimate moment, entering the world, became your first government appointment. You hadn't even opened your eyes yet, and already someone was preparing a ledger entry with your name on it. You weren't born, you were registered. And it didn't stop there. The census became a national ritual, a kind of state-sponsored roll call that asked everyone to pause their lives and declare themselves officially alive, located and cohabitating with the correct number of relatives. Every 10 years, census workers appeared like polite, clipboard-carrying ghosts, drifting through towns and hamlets collecting details about households. Who lived there? What did they do? Could they read? How old were they? Did they own land? Were they married, widowed, working, or inexplicably vague about their occupation? The census didn't merely count people, it defined them. It sorted them into roles: husband, wife, servant, labourer, child, lodger, boarder, with the soft authority of someone assigning characters in a play. Victorians might have thought they were living their own lives, but on census night, their identities became government-certified categories. And these categories mattered. They shaped taxation, political representation, welfare distribution, and even how the Crown understood national strength. Behind every statistic, a bureaucrat was quietly adjusting the machinery of the empire. Bureaucracy became one of the great Victorian inventions, not glamorous like the steam engine, not feared like the factory whistle, but undeniably powerful. Offices expanded, filing systems multiplied, clerks filled buildings like industrious paper-generating bees, sorting mountains of documents with alarming enthusiasm. It was an era when you could walk into a government office, cough lightly, and accidentally trigger the creation of 5 new forms. Some Victorians joked that paperwork reproduced faster than the population it documented. But for ordinary people, bureaucracy was both impressive and exhausting. Every major life event required interaction with the state. Want to marry? Fill out forms. Want to move? Fill out more forms. Want to open a shop? Better sit down. There are forms within forms. Want to correct a clerical error? Prepare yourself. The only thing harder than paperwork was fixing paperwork. The system didn't merely keep track of citizens, it shaped their interactions with authority. Every document was a reminder that the Crown's real power wasn't just in law, it was in information. Bureaucratic identity also created a new kind of vulnerability. If the state misrecorded you, you ceased to exist correctly. A misspelled name, an incorrect birth year, missing registration, these could complicate everything from inheritance to marriage. Your government file, once created, became more stable than you. You might age, change, relocate, or reinvent yourself, but your paperwork maintained a perfect, unchanging version of who you were supposed to be. And Victorians complied. They filled out forms, answered census questions, reported addresses, registered events, and treated clerks with the reverence normally reserved for surgeons and meteorologists. Bureaucrats weren't glamorous, but they were essential. They were the people with access to the national filing cabinets. In a society increasingly shaped by official documents that made them gatekeepers of reality itself. The psychological effect of all this record-keeping was subtle but profound. People began to internalize the idea that identity was not solely personal, it was administrative. To be recognized by society, you had to be recognized by the state. To exist securely, you had to exist on paper, and that paper, of course, belonged to the Crown. That was Victorian control at its most elegant, not through force, but through information. Not through shouting, but through counting. Not through threats, but through ledgers. The empire may have spanned continents, but its true foundation was simple, a government that knew exactly how many people slept under its sky. Victorians didn't just live their lives, they documented them. They didn't simply exist, they were catalogued. And in an age where identity became a matter of paperwork, one truth echoed everywhere. Victorian England loved rules. Written rules, unwritten rules, whispered rules, rules embroidered into samplers hanging over the mantelpiece. But no set of expectations shaped daily life more thoroughly than the vast invisible code of respectability. Unlike written laws, respectability didn't appear in official books or government ledgers. It lived instead in the air, the parlours, the drawing, rooms, and especially in the eyes of neighbours who had absolutely nothing better to do than observe your behaviour like amateur surveillance officers. You weren't arrested for being improper. Society did it for free. To understand Victorian respectability, imagine a legal system that never needed a courtroom. The moment you stepped outside your home, You entered a moral arena where the judges were everyone you passed, from the butcher sharpening his knives to the elderly widow peering from her lace curtains with the focus of a seasoned detective. The Crown didn't have to enforce these expectations directly. Society was more than happy to volunteer. In fact, gossip was practically a civic duty. Respectability wasn't one thing, it was everything. It dictated how you dressed, how you spoke, how you walked, how you greeted people, how loudly you laughed, how long you lingered near a shop window, and whether you were seen outside on a Tuesday afternoon when respectable people were, in theory, supposed to be doing respectable things indoors. Even holding your umbrella incorrectly could lead someone to question your upbringing. Victorians didn't simply behave, they curated themselves. This social pressure created a culture in which impropriety functioned like a minor crime. Not the kind that warranted jail time, but the kind that could destroy your reputation with ruthless efficiency. A misstep, too much cheerfulness in public, a dress slightly behind fashion, a handshake lacking confidence, was enough to trigger whispers that travelled faster than the actual postal system. By the time you returned home, half the town had silently concluded something was off about you. Women, especially, felt the burden of respectability more intensely than anyone else. Their movements were observed, their friendships categorized, their clothing dissected, and their demeanor judged with such precision that Victorian society essentially invented the early form of social media. But instead of likes and comments, you received nods of approval or the crushing weight of disapproving silence. A woman walking alone could be interpreted as suspicious. A woman laughing too loudly might be labelled bold. A woman expressing an opinion, scandalous. Respectability required flawless choreography, performed on the street every single day. Men were not safe either. While they had more freedom, they were expected to perform an equally rigid version of public morality. Earnest, hard-working, calm, sober, and stoic enough to appear as though emotional expression were a luxury reserved for private moments or unexpected encounters with furniture in the dark. A man who appeared idle, overly emotional, or too flamboyantly dressed risked being judged as unreliable, or worse, French. Even children were drafted into this system. Respectable Victorian children did not shout in the street, or play noisily near shops, or look at adults with anything resembling personality. They were expected to march through town with the solemnity of small diplomats, lest their behaviour reflect poorly on the household. A misbehaving child didn't just embarrass themselves, they threatened the family's carefully constructed moral architecture. What made respectability such a powerful tool of control was its consistency. The Crown didn't need to enforce it because the people enforced it upon themselves. Everyone knew the stakes. Respectability was social currency, and losing it meant losing everything that made life manageable: employment opportunities, community acceptance, marital prospects, and any chance of being invited to the kind of gatherings where people drank tea while pretending not to judge each other. In short, respectability was the Victorian version of social survival. This pressure created a fascinating paradox. People performed their best behaviour not out of personal conviction, but because they were aware of being watched. In this sense, Victorian England operated like a nationwide theatre where everyone was both actor and audience. The Crown had mastered an ingenious form of soft power. It didn't have to conduct surveillance because society was delighted to do it internally. Judgment was free, efficient, and enthusiastically distributed. Respectability also influenced the rhythm of domestic life. Homes became stages of moral display. Windows were cleaned not for hygiene, but to show neighbours that the household maintained proper standards. Curtains were chosen with care to avoid seeming gaudy or careless. Furniture arrangement, with an emphasis on upright chairs, polished surfaces, and strategically placed family Bibles, broadcast the message, "We are respectable. Please observe our respectability from the street, thank you." Even charitable acts became performances. Philanthropy was fashionable, and Victorians often engaged in public giving not out of pure generosity but to demonstrate their moral standing. Helping the poor was good, but helping them politely, visibly, and with the correct facial expression was better. A person who donated quietly risked being considered suspiciously modest. But the strangest part of this unwritten moral code was that no one ever fully succeeded at it. Respectability was a moving target. Standards shifted constantly, driven by newspapers, sermons, etiquette manuals, and the seasonal whims of fashionable society. The result was a population forever trying to meet expectations that changed the moment they achieved them. This was Victorian control at its most elegant, subtle, social, and omnipresent. The Crown didn't need to punish improper behaviour. The public took care of that with gusto. Respectability policed streets, homes, clothing, gestures, language, and even posture. It was the invisible law that Victorians followed more strictly than the written ones. In Victorian England, clothing wasn't just something you wore, it was something you declared. Every coat, corset, bonnet and boot acted like a tiny political speech announcing your class, propriety, intentions, and level of obedience to the social order. A person could remain silent their entire life and still reveal volumes simply by walking down the street. Fashion wasn't expression. It was compliance with buttons. What Victorians wore didn't just reflect personal taste. It reflected expectations shaped by the Crown, by society, and by the carefully tiered hierarchy that determined your place in the national pecking order. Clothing functioned like a visual passport. People could read your status instantly, and they did so with the same enthusiasm modern people have for scrolling social media profiles. But instead of photos of brunch, Victorian observers scanned hemlines and hat shapes. Class visibility was the core of Victorian dress culture. The wealthy did not merely dress well, they dressed expansively. Fabrics were rich, colours were bold, trims were extravagant, and tailoring was precise enough to suggest that their clothing had never once been in the same room as physical labour. Clothing was armour, not for protection, but for distinction. A well-dressed elite woman could not bend, twist, lift, or run without risking a catastrophic fashion incident, and that was precisely the point. Clothing made sure no one would ever mistake her for someone who performed work. Middle-class Victorians, meanwhile, were trapped in a perpetual fashion negotiation. Their clothing needed to signal respectability without appearing too wealthy or showy, an exhausting tightrope walk where the wrong hat could be interpreted as delusional ambition. Many wore outfits that mimicked upper-class styles but with cheaper fabric and slightly restrained decoration. They lived in a world where aspiration was acceptable, but impersonation was scandalous. A middle-class woman who wore silk too confidently risked causing small emotional earthquakes in the local gossip network. For the working classes, clothing was less about signalling ambition and more about survival, physical survival and social survival. Their garments were simple, durable, often patched, and frequently stained by the realities of labour. Everyone recognised these clothes instantly, and they were treated accordingly. A labourer wearing his work clothes into a middle-class district stood out like a chimney sweep at a royal ball. Victorian society believed in social boundaries, and clothing was the map. This class-coded wardrobe wasn't simply socially enforced, it was legally reinforced in subtle ways. Certain professions required uniforms that made workers visible, reliable, and importantly, identifiable. Policemen, postmen, nurses, railway staff, servants. They all wore attire that marked their role and reminded the public that they existed within an ordered system. A uniform told people whom to trust, whom to obey, and whom to summon when something needed official attention. The Crown didn't need to walk the streets, its uniforms did that for it. Servants' clothing was especially symbolic. Regulations and expectations dictated what garments they wore, how clean those garments had to appear, and sometimes even how often they were allowed to wash them. A servant dressed incorrectly risked not just reprimand but humiliation. The household's reputation depended on its staff looking appropriately deferential at all times. Clothing became a physical manifestation of hierarchy, soft on the skin, hard on the dignity. Even children weren't exempt from dress politics. Middle and upper-class children wore miniature versions of adult clothing, which had two purposes: to teach them proper posture and to crush any hope they had of spontaneous movement. A Victorian child in a starched collar could run only in theory. The clothing reminded them that they were being trained not for fun, but for adulthood, obedience, and well-managed silence. Women, meanwhile, lived in constant negotiation with clothing designed more for social expectations than for practicality. Corsets restricted movement and breath with such enthusiasm that fainting became a socially acceptable hobby. Bustles exaggerated silhouettes. Layers multiplied in winter and summer alike because modesty did not take seasonal breaks. Even the act of dressing required time, assistance, and emotional resilience. Victorian women weren't dressing for comfort. They were dressing for approval. Men weren't entirely free either. Proper attire meant stiff collars, fitted coats, polished shoes, and hats that signalled status. A hat was not optional. It was a moral accessory. A gentleman caught outside without one was committing a small act of public disorder. The hierarchy of hats alone could fill a museum. Top hats for the wealthy, bowlers for the respectable worker, caps for the labourer. One could practically read society like a parade of headwear. What made Victorian dress so powerful was not merely its complexity, but its visibility. Clothing turned the body into a public statement. There was no hiding your class, no pretending to belong somewhere else, no slipping quietly into anonymity. Your wardrobe announced you before you spoke. Even silence had a social outfit. And underlying all this was the Crown's quiet approval. A nation where clothing mirrored hierarchy was a nation that remained orderly. People didn't need to be told where they belonged. They wore the answer every day. Fashion reinforced structure far more effectively than any proclamation could. It transformed society into a living diagram where everyone was colour-coded. That was Victorian control. Silent, visual, and effortless. What you wore wasn't simply attire, it was obedience, stitched into fabric and enforced by everyone around you. You didn't challenge the system, you simply buttoned it up each morning. Before the Victorian era, time in Britain was a cheerful, disorganised mess. Noon could arrive whenever the local church decided the sun was about right, and one town's afternoon could be another town's late morning. It didn't matter much because most people lived locally, worked locally, and rarely needed to know what time it was anywhere else. Time was flexible, forgiving, loose enough that being early or late barely meant anything. And then the Victorians arrived with railways, clocks, schedules, and a national determination to beat time into something that behaved. By the end of the century, time didn't pass, it was enforced. The railways were the great disruptors. Trains could move faster than anything society had been forced to organise around before, and they obeyed no one's traditional sense of roughly midday. A train leaving one town at 12:15 and arriving in another at 12:07 caused immediate panic, not because of time travel, but because every community was using its own local time. What began as a charming patchwork of village noon bells quickly became a logistical nightmare. Railway companies had two options: either convince the country to adopt standardised time, or accept that every arrival board would look like the scribblings of a confused mathematician. Naturally, standardisation won. Thus emerged railway time, a radical and deeply irritating innovation for anyone who enjoyed the freedom of deciding what time it was by staring at the sun and guessing. Railway time was based on the clocks at the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, which meant London suddenly became the national timekeeper. Wherever you lived, Manchester, Bath, a tiny rural village with more sheep than people, London told you what time it was. This was the earliest form of synchronisation the Crown supported not by decree, but by allowing railways to drag the country into punctuality. Clocks began multiplying across public spaces, in train stations, factories, schools, banks, post offices and street corners, You couldn't escape time even if you wanted to. It ticked at you from walls, chimed from towers, and glared from pocket watches. Time became loud, visible, unavoidable, a national supervisor reminding you that lateness was now a personal failing rather than a regional miscommunication. A Victorian stepping outside was confronted not with the weather, but with the nearest clock. This standardisation didn't only change travel, it reshaped daily life. Work hours became rigid. Factories operated on strict schedules enforced by bells that were louder than most parents and twice as unforgiving. The workday became a synchronised ritual. Arrive when the whistle blows, eat when the second whistle blows, stop when the whistle blesses you with freedom. The factory whistle became a sound that governed everything: meals, sleep, leisure, and the persistent fear of being late by even 1 minute. In Victorian England, you didn't wake up when you were rested. You woke up when industry told you to. Schools joined the movement. Children who once drifted into learning gradually were now required to arrive at precise times, sit in precisely arranged rows, and follow bell-driven transitions. Time taught discipline as effectively as any teacher. The clock didn't just regulate education, it regulated obedience. Each ring was a reminder that life was now divided into measurable units, and those units belonged to someone else. Even household routines changed. Middle-class families began structuring their day around standardized time: breakfast at 8, visitors at 3, dinner at 6, prayers whenever guilt became overwhelming. Domestic schedules became so elaborate that etiquette books offered advice on how to plan an entire day with military precision. Punctuality wasn't simply a virtue, it was evidence of moral character. A family that ate on time was a family with self-control. A family that did not was clearly on the brink of social collapse. Public life adjusted too. Businesses opened and closed at predictable hours. Public transportation ran on fixed schedules. The post arrived at determined times, sometimes so reliably that one could start pacing 5 minutes beforehand out of pure Victorian habit. People began wearing watches not for fashion, but for self-defence. Being caught without one was like wandering into the world without trousers, unthinkable, embarrassing, and guaranteed to invite commentary. Victorian timekeeping also introduced a new form of pressure: the measurement of productivity. Once hours became standardised, work could be quantified. How long did a task take? How much output could be expected per hour? Efficiency became a national obsession. If time was money, the Victorians wanted interest. The Crown didn't need to enforce productivity. Industry and clocks did it relentlessly. Not everyone embraced this standardised world. Rural communities resisted, clinging to their local time as long as they could. Some towns displayed both London time and local time, resulting in clocks with multiple hands, which must have confused everyone, including the clocks. Eventually, though, synchronisation won. It had to. A modernising empire couldn't function with 40 different versions of 5:15. The psychological shift was enormous. For the first time in British history, people's lives were structured not by sun and season, but by precise mechanical time. This was more than organisation, it was discipline disguised as convenience. Clocks taught Victorians how to behave, when to work, when to eat, when to travel, when to rest, when to hurry, when to panic, because the train you were running toward absolutely did not wait for stragglers. Victorian England didn't just adopt time, it obeyed it. The nation became synchronised, orderly, punctual, and profoundly stressed. Time gained authority, and citizens followed as if the minute hand were a minor official from the Home Office. Because in the end, Victorian time wasn't something you experienced. It was something that happened to you. Victorian England treated work with a seriousness usually reserved for national emergencies or misplaced teacups. Employment wasn't simply how you made money. It was how you proved you were a functioning, morally upright citizen. Idleness wasn't merely frowned upon. It was practically a crime of personality. You didn't earn a living. You reported for it. Factories were at the heart of this transformation. Once the Industrial Revolution began spinning its gears, work became louder, faster, and remarkably unforgiving. The factory was a world unto itself, ruled not by bosses or foremen, but by machines, vast, clattering, steam-belching creatures that set the pace for everything around them. These machines didn't slow down for anyone. If you were tired, hungry, injured, or simply unhappy to be alive at 5 a.m., the machine did not care. The factory floor operated on a rhythm so relentless it made military drills look leisurely. Entering a factory wasn't like starting a job. It was like joining a synchronized performance choreographed by iron, steam, and very stern management. You clocked in at a precise time because the machines demanded it. You took breaks when the schedule allowed because the machines allowed it. You left when the machines stopped, which sometimes felt like being released from a day-long captivity. If you arrived late, even by minutes, you were marked as unreliable. If you fainted from exhaustion, it was your fault for not arranging your weakness more conveniently. Labour laws emerged to regulate these environments, but not always gently. Early legislation tried to protect workers from the most extreme abuses, yet at the same time reinforced the idea that work itself was a moral obligation. Laws against child labour, for example, didn't eliminate child work. They simply shaped it. Children could still be employed, just under specific conditions, because apparently the only thing more unthinkable than children working was children not working. The workhouse, meanwhile, was Victorian England's most elaborate moral lesson disguised as public assistance. It was a place where the poor could receive food and shelter, but only if they agreed to a lifestyle so bleak it discouraged anyone from entering unless they had absolutely no choice. Think of it as social welfare, except the fine print was written in misery. Families were separated upon arrival, husbands in one wing, wives in another, children elsewhere, because apparently nothing helped you escape poverty like losing your spouse and offspring at the door. Workhouses operated on the belief that suffering built character. Residents performed tasks so monotonous they could make even machines bored. Breaking stones, picking oakum, scrubbing floors, or turning handles connected to nothing, simply to ensure people stayed busy. The Victorians were firm believers that inactivity was morally contagious. If people saw others resting who knew what dangerous ideas might spread, better to keep everyone in motion, even if that motion accomplished absolutely nothing. And yet, despite all the hardship, many Victorians believed they were helping. Hard work was seen as a cure, all-purpose and infallible. Poverty wasn't considered a condition requiring support. It was viewed as a motivational issue requiring discipline. Workhouses weren't designed simply to provide assistance. They were designed to reshape the character of the poor through relentless structure. The message was clear. If you wanted help, you had to earn it by doing tasks that made you seriously consider the benefits of suffering in silence at home instead. Factory workers faced discipline of a different sort. Productivity became the measure of personal virtue. Efficient workers were praised as upright citizens. Inefficient workers were treated as liabilities, not individuals. The Crown didn't need to preach. Obedience. Industry did it far more effectively. The workplace became an environment where punctuality, endurance, and silence were considered essential traits. A Victorian worker didn't just complete tasks. They demonstrated their worthiness by completing them in the exact manner dictated by management. For many workers, the shift from agricultural life to industrial labour was deeply jarring. In the countryside, work followed the natural rhythms of daylight, weather, and seasons. In the city, work followed the rhythms of machinery, artificial, mechanical, exhausting. The sun rising no longer marked the start of the day. The factory whistle did, and the whistle was considerably less forgiving than the sun. Yet despite the grueling conditions, the Victorian philosophy of work took hold with surprising strength. Labour became intertwined with identity. People introduced themselves not by personality, but by profession. Respectability depended not only on behaviour but on the ability to toil consistently. The idea that a person could be good without being productive was about as plausible to the Victorians as a horse riding a man. This shift had profound social consequences. Communities began organising themselves around workplaces. Entire neighbourhoods formed near mills, mines and factories, their residents bound together by shared exhaustion and shared survival strategies. Work structured daily routines, shaped family life, and dictated when people could rest, socialise, or collapse. Leisure was no longer an organic part of life. It was a scheduled privilege earned through fatigue. Victorian work culture didn't just produce goods, it produced discipline. And the most effective mechanism of control wasn't the law, it was routine. By turning labour into a moral duty, the Crown and society ensured that people internalised obedience. They didn't question the system because the system lived inside their schedules. In the end, Victorian employment wasn't simply about earning wages. It was about performing your proper role in the grand machinery of the nation. You didn't wake up eager to work. You woke up because the factory demanded witnesses. You didn't gain dignity from rest. You gained it from aching joints and punctual arrival times. Victorian England was convinced of one thing above all else. Poverty did not simply happen to people. No, poverty had to be investigated, interrogated, surveilled, contained, scolded, and ideally taught a moral lesson while it was at it. To be poor was to become the subject of a national investigation, one that assumed guilt until proven otherwise. The poor didn't just receive assistance, they entered a system designed to examine their circumstances the way detectives examine chalk outlines. The good news? Help existed. The bad news? It hated you. The Poor Laws, reworked drastically in 1834, created a relief system built not on generosity but on deterrence. The architects of the law wanted to help, but only reluctantly, suspiciously, and with the intensity of people trying to avoid encouraging bad habits, such as being alive without money. Their solution was chillingly efficient. Make assistance so unpleasant that no one would ever seek it unless they were truly desperate. Poverty prevention, Victorian style, meant weaponizing discomfort. At the centre of this system stood the workhouse, a building famous for stripping the romanticism out of needing help. If Victorian charity had a physical form, it would be a workhouse, cold, severe, and architecturally designed to yell at you without making a sound. Workhouses were intentionally intimidating. High walls, stark interiors, strict routines, physical reminders that entering one meant stepping into a world where gratitude was mandatory and joy was contraband. From the moment someone arrived, the message was clear. You were now part of a system that cared for you only in the legal sense. The first act upon entering was often the forced separation of families. Husbands, wives and children were placed in different wards because the Victorians believed that emotional support might make poverty too comfortable. Apparently nothing encouraged economic recovery, like never seeing your spouse again except during supervised, emotionally sterile visiting hours. The daily life inside the workhouse was a masterpiece of engineered discouragement. Residents performed repetitive, punishing tasks, breaking stones, grinding bones, unpicking old rope, or scrubbing surfaces until they developed a philosophical relationship with despair. The work was intentionally designed not to develop any skills that could help you after you left. That would have been too useful. Instead, the tasks existed purely to justify the relief you were receiving, as though every bowl of porridge required repayment in the currency of misery. And speaking of porridge, the food was legendary in its mediocrity. Meals were nutritionally adequate in the same way that a damp basement is technically inhabitable. Workhouse diets were purposely bland, repetitive, and portioned with the precision of someone who feared you might enjoy eating too much. The goal was to keep residents alive, not comfortable. If you found yourself developing a fondness for the stew, rest assured the system had failed. Oversight inside the workhouse was constant. Rules governed everything: when you woke, when you worked, when you ate, when you prayed, how you stood, how you spoke, how you walked, how loudly you breathed. Break a rule, and the punishments range from reduced rations to solitary confinement to being assigned the dreaded task of oakum picking. which involved unravelling old ropes fibre by fibre until your fingers filed a complaint with your soul. To the Victorians, this wasn't cruelty. It was morality. They believed deeply in the idea that poverty was best corrected through discipline. The workhouse was meant to rehabilitate, to reform, to motivate. The logic went like this. If life inside the workhouse was harsh enough, people would be inspired to improve their circumstances out of sheer determination to avoid ever coming back. It was hope through discomfort, a motivational poster rewritten by someone who disliked people. Of course, the system punished the poor far more effectively than it alleviated poverty. Many avoided the workhouse at all costs, turning to relatives, neighbours, or dangerous jobs rather than submitting themselves to institutional misery. The workhouse acted not as relief, but as a warning, a symbol of what awaited anyone who slipped too far from stability. Poverty wasn't just a struggle, it was a sentence. Even outdoor relief, assistance provided outside the workhouse, was tangled in suspicion. Officials investigated applicants with the fervour of people searching for hidden wealth behind peeling wallpaper. You needed to prove that you weren't faking your hardship, a process so humiliating that some found it emotionally easier simply to continue suffering without asking for help. The system treated people not as citizens in need, but as suspects attempting to defraud the nation of its precious gruel. This approach had a psychological impact far beyond the walls of the workhouse. The fear of poverty hardened society's attitudes. People judged the poor harshly because the system taught them to. Poverty wasn't a misfortune, it was a moral failure. Help wasn't compassion, it was a last resort wrapped in barbed wire. The Crown didn't need to punish poverty directly. The system did it automatically, efficiently, and with all the warmth of a bucket of cold bath water thrown at dawn. Victorian England's treatment of poverty reveals the heart of its control, the belief that regulating behaviour was as important as providing assistance. If you needed help, you would receive it, but you would also receive a lengthy lesson in humility, obedience, and the importance of never needing help again. Victorian England did not see children as small, imaginative beings who loved games, mud, and questionable decisions. It saw them as future adults in training, raw material that needed to be shaped, polished, standardized, and positioned neatly within the machinery of the empire. Childhood was less a developmental phase, and more an apprenticeship for citizenship. By the time the Victorians were finished reorganising society, a child's life was mapped out more carefully than the plumbing system of a middle-class home. School didn't prepare you for life. It prepared you for obedience. The rise of compulsory education was one of the most transformative developments of the era. Before the Victorian state got involved, schooling varied dramatically. Some children attended church-run schools, some learned informally at home, many learned nothing academic at all, and a large number learned the kind of life skills that involve sprinting between factory machines. But as the empire grew, the Crown realised something important. It is incredibly inconvenient to run a global power when half your population cannot read a notice, count change, or understand why precisely they should salute the flag. Thus came the Education Acts, which reshaped childhood with the precision of someone reorganising a cluttered attic. Schools began popping up everywhere. Stern buildings with stern rules, stern teachers, and stern schedules. Children were gathered, sorted, instructed, and conditioned, often with an enthusiasm that suggested adults wanted to prevent the young from developing any dangerous ideas, such as individuality. Classrooms were built less like spaces for exploration and more like training centres for punctuality, silence, and handwriting so rigid it could slice butter. Desks were lined in straight rows, the blackboard ruled the front of the room, and the teacher commanded attention with the authority of a miniature monarch. Lessons were repetitive, memorization heavy, and designed to instill habits that Victorian adults valued above all else: discipline, respect, and the ability to sit still for extended periods without staging a rebellion. Reading, Writing and arithmetic were certainly taught, but beneath them lay the true curriculum: order. Children learned to arrive on time, follow instructions, respond in unison, and avoid questioning things that appeared in textbooks. If the teacher said the British Empire was the greatest force for civilization the world had ever known, then children wrote it down as fact. And if they wrote it too slowly, well, that's what rulers were for. The system also worked to reinforce class boundaries. Middle-class children experienced school as preparation for professional life. Clerks, administrators, merchants, and other important but desk-friendly roles. Working-class children, meanwhile, attended schools that emphasized practical skills and moral improvement. Education for the poor often felt like a very long sermon disguised as a school day. The message was clear: learn your place early, so you do not accidentally wander into the wrong social category later. Yet even as schools expanded, child labour remained a central part of Victorian life. Children were valuable workers, small, quick, obedient, ideally, and capable of squeezing into spaces that adults could not physically or emotionally tolerate. Factories, mines, chimney businesses and street trades all relied heavily on child labour, and early regulations were less about protecting children and more about preventing employers from accidentally wearing them out before adulthood. The government eventually introduced laws limiting child labour hours, but these laws were often more symbolic than effective. Children could still work, just fewer hours and under slightly less catastrophic conditions. A 10-year-old who spent half the day in school and the other half weaving textiles was considered fortunate by Victorian standards. You were being educated, you were being productive, you were contributing to the empire. Whether you slept through dinner because you were exhausted was considered irrelevant. In many ways, education and labour worked together to mould the next generation. Schools taught obedience, punctuality and self-control. Workplaces taught endurance, efficiency, and the delicate art of avoiding injury. Both systems produced the same outcome: adults who understood that the empire valued disciplined workers more than imaginative thinkers. Dreamers were delightful in novels, but in real life, the Victorians preferred people who knew how to follow instructions and hold ink pens at the correct angle. Parents, meanwhile, had increasingly limited say in their children's destinies. Education laws required attendance, labour laws set conditions, moral reformers preached about proper upbringing, inspectors visited homes and schools to ensure compliance. Childhood transformed from a family matter into a national project. The Crown didn't need to raise your children, it just needed to set the standards everyone else had to follow. This new understanding of childhood created an entire generation of young people who internalised obedience from the moment they learned to recite the alphabet. They grew up believing that order was natural, that timetables were logical, that authority figures were unquestionable, and that adulthood began the moment you could successfully maintain both balance and composure at a desk. Was Victorian education helpful? Absolutely. It improved literacy, expanded opportunity, and gave many children a path other than dangerous labour. But it also served a deeper purpose, preparing citizens who would fit neatly into the empire's structure. School wasn't just a place to learn, it was a place to practice being governed. Because in Victorian England, your childhood didn't belong to you, it belonged to the future the empire needed you to serve. Victorians cherished the idea of the home as a sacred private haven, your own castle, your comfort, your retreat from the chaos of smoky streets and judgmental neighbours. But Victorian England also held another equally powerful belief, that even private life needed supervision, structure, and a gentle nudge toward proper behaviour. So while your house technically belonged to you, the rules moved in as roommates you didn't remember inviting. Your house was yours, the rules just lived there too. As cities swelled with workers, families, lodgers, and people hoping their landlords were at least mildly competent, the Crown began paying very close attention to housing conditions. Not because it wanted to ensure domestic bliss, but because overcrowded, poorly built houses tended to become breeding grounds for disease. and nothing motivated Victorian officials quite like the fear of a microscopic uprising. When cholera swept through neighbourhoods, it exposed an uncomfortable truth. Private homes, if left unchecked, could become public health hazards. And so the Crown began regulating the very spaces people slept, cooked, washed, and occasionally tried to hide from distant relatives. Urban planning, once a loose mixture of guesswork and aesthetic choices, suddenly became a matter of national concern. Cities weren't growing, they were exploding. Streets tangled unpredictably, houses stacked upon one another like architectural accidents. Drainage flowed wherever gravity felt like taking it. For the first time, officials realised that hoping things sort themselves out was not an effective city management strategy. And so they intervened, creating building guidelines, sanitation laws, and inspections intended to tame the domestic wilderness. One of the first targets was overcrowding. Families crammed into tiny rooms, sometimes living, eating and sleeping in a space smaller than a middle-class Victorian wardrobe. Tenements became symbolic of unchecked poverty, a problem the government couldn't politely ignore. Housing inspectors began touring neighbourhoods, armed with official authority and impressive levels of confidence, examining homes for ventilation, drainage, structural stability, and other features that determined whether residents were living in dwellings or in technically upright hazards. If your home violated standards, you might be ordered to fix it, move out, or apologise to society for existing in suboptimal square footage. Ventilation became a national obsession. Victorians believed that bad air caused illness, and consequently, inspectors wanted windows in every room, ceilings tall enough to allow circulation, and enough open space so that people weren't breathing on each other with reckless abandon. Families who preferred a cosier environment learned to accept that their windows needed to open, even if doing so invited London's signature fog, which contained hints of coal, soot, horse odour, and mild existential dread. Sanitation standards also became part of this renewed domestic scrutiny. Indoor plumbing was a luxury, but drainage was considered essential. Houses without proper waste disposal became targets of reform, not just for the sake of the residents, but for the sake of everyone living within smelling distance. The Crown wanted homes to be clean, not out of generosity, but because epidemics had a habit of embarrassing governments. Regulations emerged requiring proper sewers, accessible water pumps, and the removal of waste in a timely manner, preferably before it staged a revolution. Landlords did not enjoy this shift. For many, the idea of maintaining their properties was as shocking as the idea of reducing rent. But the law stood firm. Homes needed to meet minimum standards. Failure to comply could result in fines, forced repairs, or forced demolition. A landlord might protest that his building had stood for 50 years, and inspectors would reply that it looked like it had been in an argument with gravity for 49 of them. Even middle-class households weren't free from scrutiny. Domestic servants needed proper living quarters, at least in theory, and households were expected to maintain order, cleanliness, and a degree of architectural sanity. Fire safety regulations grew stricter. Cooking spaces required ventilation. Staircases needed to be wide enough to avoid accidental tumbles, especially the dramatic, lawsuit-inspiring kind. Inspectors didn't care whether you liked your home's charming quirks. If the ceiling was threatening to collapse, it fell under their jurisdiction, literally and figuratively. Urban planning reform shaped entire neighbourhoods. New streets were laid out intentionally rather than accidentally. Houses were required to follow guidelines for spacing, alignment and accessibility. Officials worried about everything from the width of alleys to the quality of bricks to the proximity of homes to factories. City maps began to resemble grids rather than sprawling doodles. Private homes, in other words, became part of a civic system. And systems, as Victorian England proved repeatedly, demanded order. This shift changed how people understood privacy. Victorians were used to prying neighbours, but prying officials were a new experience. Your home was still yours, but it was also considered a node in a national network of health, safety and moral stability. If your cesspit leaked into the street, you were jeopardizing not just yourself but the empire's well-maintained dignity. If your windows stayed shut, you risked poisoning your family and possibly your neighbours. Even the arrangement of your home's internal spaces reflected living standards the state hoped to encourage. And then came the moral layer. While inspectors didn't evaluate your family's moral choices, they deeply believed that proper housing shaped proper behaviour. Crowded homes bred chaos. Poor ventilation bred sickness. Dark rooms bred crime, or at least poor posture. A well-regulated home produced well-regulated citizens. Domestic order and public order were seen as intimately connected, two halves of the same neatly folded Victorian napkin. By the end of the century, the home wasn't just a private refuge. It was a regulated environment, a miniature civic responsibility. Families learned that locking their doors did not lock out the influence of the crown. Standards seeped into daily life through architecture, rules and expectations that followed people indoors like silent, judgmental houseguests. Victorians still called their homes castles, but the crown made sure every castle had proper drainage, sufficient airflow, adequate light, and enough structural integrity to avoid collapsing during tea. Victorian England had a complicated relationship with health. On one hand, authorities desperately wanted people not to die in large, embarrassing numbers. On the other, they were not especially interested in people feeling comfortable while staying alive. Health, to the Victorian state, meant surviving long enough to contribute to the empire, not luxuriating in soft pillows, clean air, or a life free from the aroma of questionable drainage. You weren't cared for, you were regulated. This attitude emerged from necessity. Cities were growing at a staggering rate, cramming people into tight quarters, piling waste into streets, and teaching entire neighbourhoods the vocabulary of unpleasant smells. Cholera outbreaks hit with the enthusiasm of unwanted houseguests. Typhoid thrived wherever sanitation failed. Tuberculosis treated the population like a long-term subscription service. It became clear that if the government didn't intervene, cities would transform from bustling centres of industry into experimental mazes for bacteria. Thus began the rise of public health as a national priority, though priority in Victorian terms meant mandatory rules, stern warnings and occasional moralising lectures. The Public Health Act sought to impose order on the unruly chaos of urban living. Drainage, clean water, garbage removal, and the containment of disease all became matters of law. The Crown wasn't interested in whether people enjoyed cleanliness. It was interested in whether cleanliness prevented cholera from embarrassing the government yet again. One of the new heroes of this movement was the sanitary inspector, a role that combined the observational intensity of a detective, the moral confidence of a preacher, and the personal charm of someone who knocks on your door unannounced and declares your cesspit illegal. Inspectors roamed neighbourhoods searching for violations, leaking pipes, blocked drains, standing water, decaying animals, overflowing privies, and air quality that suggested the building itself was attempting to surrender. The inspector's visit was not a comforting experience. These were not doctors offering remedies or city workers providing repairs. They were enforcers of health standards, armed with clipboards and the unwavering belief that your home, your habits, and possibly your entire lifestyle posed a threat to public safety. A single blocked drain could earn you a stern notice. A pile of refuse in the wrong location could land you in front of officials. Victorians learned that public health wasn't about personal wellness, it was about compliance. Water supply became a major battleground. Many neighbourhoods relied on pumps that drew water from sources alarmingly close to sewage systems, proximity that should have alarmed everyone but didn't until cholera arrived to demonstrate why this was a very bad idea. Scientists like John Snow eventually traced outbreaks to contaminated water, but before that revelation, authorities tried everything short of asking the water politely to behave differently. New regulations required cities to build proper waterworks, ensuring clean water reached households. This was a triumph of modern hygiene, but not necessarily a triumph of comfort. Pipes broke, pumps malfunctioned, and the distribution of clean water often depended on whether your neighbourhood had enough political influence to receive investment. Health was improving, but convenience lagged behind at a leisurely Victorian pace. Sewage disposal underwent even more dramatic reform. Early in the century, waste flowed into rivers, streams, streets, and anywhere gravity allowed. Eventually, massive sewer projects transformed the underground landscape of cities, channeling waste away from populated areas. These engineering marvels saved lives, reduced disease, and gave Victorians something new to boast about. But they also brought new rules. Households were suddenly responsible for connecting to sewer lines, maintaining drains, and ensuring that nothing unapproved made its way into the system. Comfort was irrelevant. Compliance was everything. Public health laws didn't stop at infrastructure. They also targeted behaviour. Spitting in public, overcrowding living spaces, disposing of waste improperly, allowing animals to wander unsupervised, each became an offence under various health and nuisance acts. Victorian England didn't just improve sanitation, it transformed hygiene into a moral duty. People weren't encouraged to avoid disease, they were expected to avoid contributing to it. Hospitals, too, were shaped by regulation. Once neglected, grim institutions, they began to adopt standards for cleanliness, ventilation, and organisation. Patients benefited, but they were also subject to rules governing visitation hours, movement within wards, and even silence. Medical staff enforced these regulations with the sternness of people who believed germs could be frightened into submission. Meanwhile, the state grew increasingly confident in deciding what counted as healthy. Ventilation became essential, whether or not you enjoyed cold drafts sweeping through your home. Streets had to be swept, whether or not you found your taxes annoying. Waste had to be removed, whether or not you believed the local collector was performing a ritual of procrastination. The nation didn't ask you what you preferred. It informed you what was mandatory. The result was a fascinating paradox. Victorians lived in an era of expanding public health improvements while simultaneously enduring constant scrutiny over their daily habits. They were healthier than their predecessors, but not necessarily more comfortable. The Crown was not trying to pamper its citizens, it was trying to prevent preventable catastrophes. Comfort might make people soft. Cleanliness made them obedient, and, crucially, less likely to die inconveniently. By the late century, public health had become a hallmark of Victorian progress. Disease rates dropped. Cities smelled marginally less apocalyptic. Life expectancy began to rise. But the machinery behind these improvements was built on regulation, oversight, and the official belief that people could not be trusted to manage their own health without supervision. You weren't invited to participate in health reform. You were enrolled in it, automatically, relentlessly, and often noisily. Because in Victorian England, health wasn't kindness, it was policy. Victorian England loved rules, and it loved food, but it deeply distrusted the relationship between the two. The 19th century diet was a thrilling gamble in which every meal carried the possibility of being delicious, disappointing, or mildly poisonous. Markets overflowed with produce, meats, breads, sweets, and spices, but also with creative interpretations of what those foods were supposed to be. The Crown eventually stepped in, not because it worried about your culinary happiness, but because too many people were dying in ways that made officials look negligent. Dinner didn't nourish you, it passed inspection. To understand the Victorian food problem, imagine a world without standardised packaging, nutritional labels, refrigeration, or the faintest concept of consumer protection. Dishonest vendors could stretch, dye, dilute, or outright counterfeit anything they sold. Tea leaves were reused so often that they deserved pension plans. Cocoa powder might contain brick dust. Bread could be whitened with chalk. Pepper had an alarming tendency to include ground-up twigs, which provided texture but regrettably also reminded diners that forests were not meant to be eaten. Milk, meanwhile, could be watered down to the point where even the cows might fail to recognise it. The issue wasn't simply greed, it was survival. Small vendors struggled to compete in an evolving market, and adulteration became a desperate strategy to stretch supply and profits. Consumers, unfortunately, became part of this experiment, learning the hard way that freshly ground didn't always mean edible. Food wasn't just nourishment. It was a negotiation between your wallet and your digestive tract. Enter the Adulteration Acts, which attempted to bring order to this culinary chaos. The government began sending inspectors into markets armed with authority, notebooks, and an unwavering confidence that they could distinguish real butter from something that had started life as candle wax. Their job was not to tell vendors how to improve their craft. It was to make sure no one was poisoned so quickly or so dramatically that it made headlines. Inspectors tested staples like bread, flour, butter, beer, and milk. They looked for the chemicals that dishonest sellers used to mimic freshness: copper salts for vegetables, red lead for sweets, borax for meat preservation. Every discovery came with both relief and suspicion. Relief that the issue had been caught, and suspicion about how many people had unknowingly consumed similar ingredients for years while wondering why their dinner tasted faintly metallic. But enforcing these laws was difficult. Markets were sprawling, vendors were numerous, and inspectors were few. Many traders became experts at evading detection by selling perfectly acceptable goods on inspection days and returning to their usual creativity the moment officials left. Markets developed a wary relationship with inspectors who were respected, resented, obeyed, ignored, or fooled depending on the day and the vendor's mood. Still, the presence of food laws changed public expectations. People began demanding higher standards, not out of luxury, but out of self-preservation. Middle-class households, armed with newly published domestic science guides, became miniature detectives of meal preparation. Housewives tested ingredients, scrutinized unusual colors, and became suspicious of anything that sparkled, fizzed, or glowed in ways nature had not intended. Cookbooks, once devoted to recipes, now included advice on avoiding fraud, identifying impurities, and filing formal complaints. Your kitchen became an investigative lab where flavor was secondary to survival. Food safety also became part of the moral landscape. Clean markets reflected clean citizens. Proper ingredients demonstrated proper values. A household that fed its members pure food was not only healthy but respectable. Adulteration, meanwhile, was associated with dishonesty, greed, and moral decay. Vendors who tampered with food weren't just criminals, they were threats to the nation's digestive integrity. Even restaurants and street vendors faced scrutiny. A dining establishment could earn a reputation for excellence or infamy based on how frequently customers survived their meals. Street food, once beloved, became a gamble that required bravery, luck, or an iron stomach. Public health officials viewed these vendors with suspicion, convinced that anyone selling food outdoors was one bad decision away from causing an outbreak. Regulations forced many to adjust recipes, improve setups, or retire entirely. Markets themselves were redesigned. Stalls were reorganized for easier monitoring. Drainage improved so fishmongers weren't ankle-deep in questionable puddles. Vendors were required to label items accurately or face fines. Slowly, food began to shift from a chaotic free-for-all into a system with rules. Rules that made eating slightly less terrifying. This transformation didn't eliminate Victorian culinary dangers, but it reduced them enough that consumers became more confident and more demanding. The government's involvement created the expectation that food should not actively conspire against its eater, and that expectation pushed the entire nation toward modern standards. Yet even with all these reforms, Victorian food never lost its unpredictability. Regulations were imperfect, enforcement inconsistent, and science still evolving. Some households continued to buy whatever was cheapest, hoping for the best. Others distrusted vendors entirely and insisted on growing, grinding, or brewing their food at home. The result was a strange balance. Meals became safer, But food laws became yet another reminder that the Crown didn't teach you what to cook, it taught you what not to trust. The psychological effect was profound. Eating, once instinctive, required analysis. Families approached the dinner table with vigilance. Newspapers reported scandals of contaminated goods. Medical journals lectured about chemical dangers. And through it all, the government stood watch, attempting to tame a food system as wild as the age that produced it. Victorian England modernised many things: industry, science, infrastructure. But few transformations were as quietly revolutionary as the shift from food as a gamble to food as a regulated commodity. For the first time, the state declared that eating should not be a form of Russian roulette played with flour. Victorian England had an interesting relationship with alcohol. It tolerated it, regulated it, feared it, preached about it, and consumed it enthusiastically while insisting that enthusiasm was the real problem. Drinking was permitted, of course. This was not ancient Sparta, but doing it with too much joy, too frequently, or with the wrong facial expression could get you moral side-eye from half the population. You could drink, just not enthusiastically. To appreciate this dynamic, you must imagine a society built on contradiction. Victorian England was deeply thirsty. Beer was safer than most water sources, gin warmed the bones in cold climates, and wine flowed generously at upper-class dinners. Yet this same society became obsessed with curbing alcohol consumption, not through outright prohibition, but through a dizzying maze of licensing laws and moral persuasion. The Crown did not ban your pint. It simply made the process of obtaining, serving, and enjoying alcohol feel like a lengthy exam in proper behaviour. At the heart of this system was the Alcohol Licensing Act, a collection of rules that decided who could sell alcohol, when they could sell it, where they could sell it, and to whom. The laws treated alcohol like a slightly misbehaving friend, tolerated in public but watched closely, lest it start an argument, break a window, or lead otherwise respectable citizens into the melodic embrace of public singing. Publicans, owners of pubs and drinking establishments, were required to secure licences, renew them regularly, and demonstrate unwavering commitment to keeping order, cleanliness, and moral decorum. A pub wasn't simply a business, it was a moral promise. The state's reasoning was straightforward. If people insisted on drinking, someone needed to be responsible for supervising them. A publican who allowed rowdy behaviour faced consequences, including fines or loss of licence. In practical terms, this meant pub owners spent half their day serving customers and the other half acting as unofficial, peace officers, ensuring no one became too cheerful, too loud, too affectionate, too opinionated, or too obviously intoxicated. Victorian pub management was less about pouring beer and more about maintaining a delicate ecosystem of controlled merriment. But licences alone were not enough to pacify the nation's moral guardians. Enter the temperance movement, a formidable alliance of reformers, churches, activists, pamphlet writers, and determined mothers who saw alcohol not as a drink, but as a national crisis disguised in glassware. They believed that liquor eroded moral character, shattered families, damaged souls, and encouraged men to sit down when they should be standing up responsibly. Their campaigns filled the streets with speeches, the newspapers with warnings, and the parlours with stern conversations about the dangers of demon drink. Temperance societies opened reading rooms, offered sober alternative activities, and distributed pamphlets featuring cautionary tales in which a single glass of gin led inevitably to unemployment, disgrace, debt, disease, and dramatic fainting scenes. They insisted that virtuous citizens should abstain entirely, or at the very least take such tiny sips that even angels would consider them polite. Children were encouraged to take temperance pledges, promising to grow up into adults who would never find themselves singing in public after too much ale. The movement's influence was so pervasive that even the Crown felt compelled to respond. Regulations tightened, hours of sale were restricted, drunkenness became a punishable offence, especially if displayed flamboyantly. Police patrolled the streets looking for those whose gait or volume suggested they were violating the nation's strict policy against visible enjoyment. Being drunk wasn't illegal, but appearing drunk was treated with the same gravity as violating a social contract. Working-class neighbourhoods felt these regulations most intensely. Pubs were essential social hubs, places to gather after exhausting shifts, exchange news, complain about bosses, and momentarily forget the persistent existential dread of the 19th century. But these were also the establishment's most scrutinised. Reformers believed that working-class drinking was dangerous because it led to disorder, neglect, and, worst of all, fun. Middle and upper-class drinking, however, existed in a more graceful moral bubble. Wealthy Victorians enjoyed wine, brandy and champagne with meals, confident that their table manners would prevent them from accidentally slipping into working-class levels of enthusiasm. The temperance movement aimed its sharpest criticisms at pubs, not drawing rooms. Respectability dictated that if you must drink, do it surrounded by candles, mahogany, and people who will never shout cheers loud enough to echo. The gender divide shaped drinking culture as well. Men could drink publicly, albeit under watchful eyes, while women faced stricter expectations. Female drunkenness was treated as a moral failing of catastrophic proportions. Women who entered pubs were judged immediately, unless they belonged to the small handful of respectable establishments that served tea, thin sandwiches, and alcohol only in doses small enough to preserve their delicacy. In temperance literature, a drunk man was a problem. A drunk woman was a warning. Despite all the moral pressures, drinking remained a thriving pastime. Pubs continued to fill each evening, and reformers continued to despair each morning. The licensing system provided structure, but it also created a ritual. People learned when they could drink, where they could drink, how much they could drink, and just how carefully they needed to behave afterwards to avoid police involvement or neighbourly scandal. Victorian drinking culture was a negotiation between pleasure and propriety, indulgence and restraint. The Crown didn't stop people from drinking, it simply ensured that every pint was accompanied by a silent whisper of bureaucratic oversight. Publicans moderated behaviour, police monitored drunkenness, reformers monitored morality. And through it all, Victorians continued to enjoy their ale, cautiously, quietly, and with the understanding that smiling too broadly might be considered incriminating. The result was a unique system in which alcohol was available, but enjoyment was suspicious. Drinking was legal, but enthusiasm required plausible deniability. Pubs were permitted, but fun needed to be moderated like a potentially explosive ingredient. In Victorian England, you could raise a glass, but raise it too high, and someone somewhere would take notes. When Victorians woke up one morning and discovered uniformed police officers walking the streets, they were not entirely sure whether they should feel safer or inspected. The rise of modern policing in the 19th century reshaped the relationship between ordinary people and the law. Previously, law enforcement had been a rather chaotic affair. Part-time constables, night watchmen who occasionally napped on duty, and enthusiastic citizens responding to crimes with whatever tools happened to be nearby. But with the creation of the Metropolitan Police in 1829, the Crown announced something revolutionary. Order would now be a full-time job. The new police weren't introduced to terrorise criminals. They were introduced to prevent things from escalating into situations where terrorising criminals seemed necessary. Robert Peel, the architect of the modern force, envisioned officers as calm, steady guardians who blended into communities, earning trust through presence rather than force. They were supposed to be friendly, disciplined, and relentlessly polite. So polite, in fact, that even surveillance felt like a courteous gesture. You weren't followed. You were observed politely. Their uniforms were designed with intention. The dark blue coats resembled military attire, but without the intimidating red coats associated with soldiers. The message was clear. These men represented authority, but not aggression. They carried truncheons instead of firearms and whistles instead of swords. Their most powerful weapon wasn't intimidation, it was predictability. They patrolled the same streets, at the same times, moving with such regularity that citizens could set their schedules by the rhythm of the bobby's footsteps. This shift changed public life profoundly. Suddenly, the idea of being watched was not unusual. It was expected. The police didn't chase criminals because they didn't need to. Their presence alone discouraged wrongdoing. A potential pickpocket might reconsider if a bobby appeared around the corner with the expression of someone who had nowhere else to be, and no intention of blinking until after the crime window passed. Crime prevention was no longer reactive, it was atmospheric. These officers had astonishingly broad roles. They directed traffic, extinguished rowdy behaviour, broke up arguments, located stray animals, and occasionally retrieved lost children who had wandered into neighbourhoods they considered thrilling, but were, in fact, extremely inconvenient. They investigated suspicious noises, wandering drunks, unusual smells, loose cartwheels, abandoned parcels, and anything else that appeared out of place. The Victorian police officer was half detective, half social supervisor, and half community babysitter, which made for three halves, but Victorians were not overly concerned with mathematical accuracy when assigning duties. The presence of police also reshaped city rhythms. People moved through streets with new awareness, conscious that their behaviour might be witnessed, judged, or gently corrected. A drunken dispute no longer had to escalate. A police officer could stroll over and deflate tension with calm authority. Mischief that once thrived in dark alleys found itself inconvenienced by the sudden habit of officers appearing precisely when mischief was least convenient. Public order became not just a concept, but a performance, and the police were its stage managers. Of course, not everyone greeted this new system with open arms. Some saw the police as instruments of social control rather than community guardians. The working classes, in particular, worried that officers existed primarily to monitor them, not because they were more criminal than other groups, but because they were more visible in the public spaces where police patrolled most heavily. A worker lingering too long outside a pub, a labourer crossing the street too energetically, or a group of friends laughing too loudly could attract the kind of polite attention that made people straighten their posture and pretend they were contemplating a moral improvement. Middle-class households, meanwhile, welcomed the police with enthusiasm. Officers were seen as protectors of property and stability, human insurance, policies against disorder. To them, the steady presence of patrolling bobbies turned the streets into safe corridors where shopping, socialising and commuting could occur without the constant threat of pickpockets or rowdy disruptions. Safety and surveillance blended so seamlessly that many forgot they were being watched at all. Over time, the police developed methods that would become standard across the world: beat patrols, crime reporting systems, organisational charts, and standardised procedures. The creation of criminal records meant repeat offenders could be tracked with increasing precision. The introduction of detective units turned investigations from amateur guesswork into something resembling methodical science. And the very act of recording information, names, addresses, details, habits, allowed the Crown to extend its observational reach far beyond a single street corner. Yet despite this growing sophistication, the core of Victorian policing remained unchanged. Officers were expected to be visible. They walked the streets rather than hiding behind desks. Their authority came from familiarity as much as from law. Crime prevention depended on the quiet reminder that someone was always noticing. Even those who committed no crimes found themselves adjusting behaviour slightly in the presence of a bobby, as if participating in a nationwide etiquette lesson. This visibility created a new social environment, one where surveillance became background noise. The Crown didn't need to enforce control harshly when it could enforce it gently. A wandering officer carried more influence than a posted proclamation. The knowledge that someone in uniform might observe your actions created an internal guide for acceptable behaviour. By the end of the century, the police had become an ordinary part of urban life. Children knew them by name, shopkeepers relied on them, landlords complained to them, neighbours greeted them, criminals adapted to them, and society internalized the quiet message they embodied: you are always seen. In a world obsessed with order, the police were the eyes that never closed, though they did blink politely. Victorian policing didn't create fear, it created awareness. Public life in Victorian England felt less like moving through a city and more like participating in an elaborate unspoken performance. The streets, parks, promenades, and public squares were not merely places to exist. They were stages upon which citizens enacted the daily ritual of being properly Victorian. Behaviour was monitored not only by the police but by society itself, which considered public order an essential ingredient of national dignity. You were free to walk, in the correct manner. The Victorians were obsessed with making their public environments orderly, controlled, and aesthetically pleasing. Cities were crowded, noisy, and full of unpredictable elements. Horses, carts, vendors, children, occasional sewage eruptions. But within this chaos, authorities tried to create pockets of carefully managed civility. Urban planners and reformers believed that public space shaped public morality. If citizens were exposed to clean, structured, peaceful surroundings, they would be more inclined to behave respectably. This theory was optimistic but persuasive enough to reshape Britain's urban landscape. Parks became the crown jewels of regulated public life. Once the preserve of aristocrats, they were increasingly open to the public, but only under conditions that preserved their elegance. Walking paths were carefully laid out, benches placed strategically, and signs posted to remind visitors that the grass was for looking at, not lounging on. The design of the park dictated the behaviour of its users. Meandering footpaths encouraged genteel strolling rather than energetic running. Wide lawns created expansive views but discouraged rough play. Lakes invited admiration, not swimming. The park wasn't a space for freedom. It was a curated environment in which nature performed obedience. Even park visitors were expected to perform. Women in elegant dresses and men in fitted coats were supposed to glide through the scenery, nodding politely, keeping to designated paths, and maintaining posture with the rigidity of chairs in a well-run drawing room. Any display of unregulated enthusiasm, shouting, racing, lying on the grass, eating loudly, was considered an affront to both the environment and the empire. Parks were democratic spaces only in the sense that everyone was equally required to behave. Streets, meanwhile, were governed by their own code of choreography. Traffic was an unruly mix of horses, carts, omnibuses, pedestrians, errand boys, stray dogs, and the occasional runaway vehicle. Managing this chaos required rules, and those rules required observance. Pedestrians were expected to walk briskly but not hurriedly, confidently but not arrogantly, and always on the correct side of the pavement. Stopping abruptly, blocking a walkway, or standing in doorways were treated as social crimes worthy of sharp looks and muttered commentary. Crossing the street was practically an art form. You were expected to move with awareness, decisiveness, and the agility of someone navigating a mild battlefield. Hesitation caused traffic issues, recklessness caused injury, and strolling diagonally across the road invited judgment from bystanders who believed strongly in straight lines. In many ways, Victorian street behaviour resembled a polite version of combat training, minus the weapons but retaining the constant threat of being trampled by a horse. Public squares provided additional opportunities for social performance. These open spaces hosted markets, political gatherings, religious events, and public speeches. But even in moments of excitement, decorum was expected. Crowds could gather, but they were expected to gather neatly. Vendors could call out their goods, but not too loudly. Speeches were tolerated so long as they did not disrupt surrounding businesses or ignite the kind of enthusiasm that made officials nervous. Public squares were carefully managed expressions of civic life, designed to allow participation without encouraging unpredictability. Rules for public behaviour extended beyond movement into the subtleties of appearance and conduct. Clothing had to be tidy, conversation had to be moderate, Interactions with strangers had to follow etiquette. Polite nods, minimal eye contact, and no sudden attempts at friendliness unless you wanted to be mistaken for someone selling something dubious. Public flirtation was frowned upon. Public arguments were scolded into silence. Public displays of emotion were considered embarrassing, unless you were mourning. Mourning was an exception that came with its own strict guidelines. Even leisure activities were regulated. Music in public parks required permits. Gathering to play games required authorization. Street performances hovered between cultural enrichment and moral threat, depending on whether the performer looked sufficiently respectable. If a man played violin with artistic finesse, he was an asset to the community. If he played with too much enthusiasm, he was asked to move along. Underlying all these rules was a belief that public order was a visible reflection of national success. A well-behaved populace created the impression of a well-governed nation. Disorder, clutter, noise, and spontaneous behaviour were seen as hints of social decline. Even children, who might naturally have been expected to run, shout, and express joy, were instead urged to walk calmly, speak softly, and display a level of discipline more suited to miniature diplomats than young humans. This carefully choreographed public life was not enforced entirely through punishment, though law and police presence played a role, but through social pressure. People learned the choreography by watching others, by experiencing subtle corrections from strangers, and by absorbing cultural expectations. Deviating from the script made you conspicuous, and being conspicuous in Victorian England was a moral hazard. If a person walked too quickly, too slowly, too noisily, or too confidently, they were reminded, in tones ranging from gentle to scathing, that public space belonged to everyone, and that everyone expected a performance. By the late 19th century, Victorian cities had become environments where freedom existed within invisible lines. You were free to stroll, sit, admire the scenery, conduct business, meet friends, and move about your day, provided you did so within the unspoken framework of public decorum. You had liberty, but only the kind that behaved politely. In Victorian England, public life was a dance. The music was subtle, the rules were strict, and everyone was expected to know the steps. Victorian England loved progress. Railways, steamships, postal networks, telegraphs, but it loved regulating progress even more. Travel, once a chaotic adventure involving muddy roads, unpredictable inns, and a constant risk of meeting sheep in the middle of the highway, became something new, a bureaucratic experience. Victorians could now move faster than any previous generation, but speed didn't mean freedom. Movement came wrapped in rules, papers, inspections, and the subtle suggestion that going somewhere was less a personal decision and more a request filed with the universe. You didn't go places, you were processed there. The railway was the beginning of this transformation. Before railways, the pace of travel matched the pace of life, slow, occasional, and largely unregulated. But trains changed everything. Suddenly, schedules existed. Timetables mattered. Stations became hubs of order where clocks told the truth whether people liked it or not. A traveller couldn't simply wander onto a train. They had to consult schedules printed in tiny font, purchase a ticket from a stern clerk, and locate the correct platform without committing the Victorian sin of appearing confused in public. Railway companies introduced rules to ensure that thousands of passengers could travel without turning stations into overcrowded experiments in chaos theory. Passengers were told where to stand, when to board, which door to use, and where luggage should be placed. Even sitting became regulated. Different classes had different carriages, first class with plush upholstery, second with something slightly less plush, and third with wooden benches that said, "We support you, but only minimally." The implicit message was clear. Movement was allowed, but social order moved with you. Railway travel also introduced the curious requirement of tickets, small pieces of paper that determined whether a person was legitimately travelling or attempting to ride the empire's technological marvels without contributing to station revenue. Tickets had to be purchased, stamped, presented, inspected, and occasionally surrendered to ticket collectors who wielded iron hole punches with clerical authority. Victorians learned that losing a ticket was a crime against efficiency. A traveller who misplaced theirs could expect suspicion, delays, and possibly a lecture on responsibility. Even luggage was part of this new regulation. Bags were weighed, tagged, sorted, and sometimes handled with so much bureaucracy that passengers wondered if their belongings were travelling under a different legal identity. Large trunks might be loaded separately, requiring passengers to trust that their possessions would arrive at the same station, and preferably on the same day. The Crown, meanwhile, became increasingly interested in who was moving around the kingdom and why. Internal travel didn't require official permission, but it was monitored through railway logs, passenger lists, and the sheer visibility of train stations. Movement became traceable. A Victorian who travelled, AEM, frequently left a paper trail long enough to become a small archive. Mobility was no longer anonymous, it was documented. International travel brought even more oversight. Early Victorian passports were simple documents, often handwritten, occasionally bearing sketches of the traveller, and always carrying the unmistakable tone of officialdom. Passports were not technically required for all travel, but many countries demanded them, and British subjects learned that having one made border crossings smoother, or at least less dramatically inconvenient. The Victorian passport did not include photographs until later in the century, which meant officials relied on descriptions that were sometimes vague enough to apply to half the population. A document might describe someone as having brown hair, average height, mild disposition, which could have referred to almost any polite Victorian man not currently fainting from heat stroke. Steamship travel added another layer of supervision. Passenger lists were compiled for safety, immigration control, and the general Victorian desire to categorise everything that moved. Travellers boarding a ship were recorded with the same seriousness given to cargo. Ports employed inspectors, customs officers, and officials who could decide whether a traveller's belongings posed a danger to health, morality, or the pleasing orderliness of the empire. Too much luggage raised eyebrows, too little raised even more. Even domestic mobility, moving between counties, seeking work in industrial cities, visiting relatives, came with unofficial scrutiny. Landlords, employers, police, and parish authorities all took interest in who arrived and who departed. Sudden movement suggested instability. Repeated movement suggested suspicion. Staying put was respectable. Travelling frequently was something the upper classes romanticised, and the working classes struggled to explain. Public coaches had rules as well. Before railways took over, long-distance travel, coaches operated under schedules enforced by turnpikes and toll gates. Travellers were expected to sit properly, avoid arguing with the driver, refrain from alarming the horses, and keep conversations at a volume that would not disturb other passengers, rules that Victorians followed imperfectly but acknowledged nonetheless. Underlying all these regulations was a core Victorian belief. Mobility required management. People moving freely could cause disorder. People moving systematically contributed to the efficiency of the nation. Travel was not seen as an expression of personal liberty, but as a function of civilization, something that demanded oversight, coordination, and at least one official with a stern expression and a ledger. And Victorians complied. They queued for tickets, memorised timetables, obeyed directions, and tolerated delays with a stoicism that bordered on spiritual achievement. They accepted that travel wasn't simply a journey from point A to point B. It was a ritual of paperwork, patience, observation, and controlled momentum. By the late 1800s, travel had become both easier and more supervised than ever before. Mobility was modern, freedom was conditional, and going somewhere meant navigating a system that wanted to know who you were, where you came from, and why your trunk smelled faintly of preserved fish. Victorian England adored newspapers in the same way it adored steam engines, long speeches, and mildly judgmental conversation. Papers were everywhere, morning papers, evening papers, penny papers, illustrated papers, political papers, religious papers, sensational papers that would print anything short of a confession to treason, and highbrow papers that condemned sensational papers while secretly reading them. The Victorians devoured news with the appetite of a society that had just discovered literacy and immediately wanted something dramatic to read. But for all this enthusiasm, freedom of the press came with strings attached, legal strings, moral strings, and strings pulled quietly by people who preferred journalists to speak boldly, but not too boldly. You could say anything, carefully. The Victorian press expanded rapidly because technology had finally caught up with curiosity. Steam-powered printing machines, cheaper paper, and improved distribution networks meant newspapers could reach places previously visited only by travelling salesmen and rumours. Suddenly, millions of people had access to news, opinions, scandals, scientific breakthroughs, serialised novels, and political debates. The printed word became one of the century's great democratizers. Yet this explosion of information terrified the authorities just a little. A literate population armed with opinions was exciting, but also unpredictable. The Crown and Parliament believed in freedom of expression, but only under responsible conditions, a word which in Victorian legal terms meant, "We trust you, but we'd also like to supervise every step you take, just in case." Enter press regulation. The most influential tools of control were the libel laws, which were not simply legal guidelines. They were exquisitely sharpened instruments of persuasion. A newspaper could criticise institutions, but it had to phrase such criticism like a polite disagreement. A newspaper could investigate scandals, provided it possessed evidence that was both ironclad and approved by someone with a wig. A newspaper could accuse someone of wrongdoing, but only if it enjoyed the thrilling experience of being sued. Libel trials became part of Victorian entertainment. Politicians, businessmen, and aristocrats sued newspapers with the confidence of people who had access to very expensive lawyers. Editors learned quickly that printing something bold was fun, but printing something bold and legally actionable was career suicide. As a result, articles often danced delicately around controversial topics. Accusations were written in cautious phrases. Outrage was couched in hypotheticals. A piece might hint at corruption, but with the kind of grammatical uncertainty that allowed editors to deny everything in court. Censorship existed too, though not in the dramatic bonfire of books sense. It operated quietly, subtly, and often through self-policing. Certain subjects, obscenity, blasphemy, sedition, were legally off-limits. Newspapers that ventured too close to these themes risked fines, arrests, or sudden visits from officials who hated disorder almost as much as they hated unregulated journalism. Writers learned to bend their creativity into shapes that fit within approved boundaries. The clever ones became masters of implication. The cautious ones stuck to weather reports. Political reporting required especially delicate handling. Newspapers could support parties, criticise policies, and rally voters, but they were expected to do so with decorum. Calling a politician incompetent was acceptable. Calling him corrupt required documentation. Calling him a danger to civilization was acceptable only if done with vocabulary elaborate enough to sound academic. Victorian insults were a form of literary performance, and yet, despite these limits, the press became a formidable force. Journalists exposed scandals, questioned government actions, criticised social inequality, and campaigned for reforms. Newspapers shaped public opinion far more effectively than any official proclamation. The Crown understood this power and monitored it closely, not to silence criticism, but to ensure it did not ignite unrest or undermine institutions. The Victorian system did not censor ideas aggressively. It managed them like a garden, pruning, trimming, guiding growth, ensuring nothing unruly climbed over the fence. The press also shaped morality. Newspapers published stories warning against vice, praising virtue, and reinforcing the idea that proper behaviour should be displayed like furniture in a well-kept, Parlour. Articles described heroic rescues, tragic accidents, courtroom dramas, religious messages, and etiquette advice. Even the crime reports, immensely popular, served a moral purpose. Readers learned what not to do by observing what others had been caught doing. For working-class readers, cheap newspapers offered education, entertainment, and a sense of participation in national life. For middle-class readers, newspapers served as daily confirmations of their worldview. For the upper classes, newspapers were useful tools, sometimes to influence opinion, sometimes to monitor public mood, and occasionally to ruin a rival's reputation through strategic leaks. The press did not merely report Victorian society, it performed it. Behind the scenes, editors and proprietors navigated an intricate dance with power. They wanted readership, they wanted influence, but they also wanted to avoid police visits, fines, and public embarrassments. As a result, newspapers practiced a sophisticated form of self-regulation. Writers learned to express outrage without sounding rebellious, critique without sounding radical, and investigate without sounding accusatory. A good Victorian journalist was both bold and diplomatic, someone who could write a scathing criticism using sentences so polite they practically curtsied. Despite all this, the boundaries of press freedom gradually expanded. Public appetite for information grew too quickly to contain. Investigations became more daring. Political commentary became sharper. Satirical papers emerged that tested the limits of respectable humour. And as literacy spread, newspapers became the unofficial parliament of the streets, a space where national debates unfolded daily. Victorian England did not achieve full press freedom, but it achieved something else, a culture in which ideas could circulate, challenge, provoke, and enlighten, so long as they did so in language refined enough to avoid prosecution. Victorian England was a place where faith shaped daily life with the soft but constant pressure of a hand resting on your shoulder. Religion was everywhere, printed in sermons, spoken in parlours, woven into school lessons, embedded in political speeches, and echoed from every church tower in cities and villages alike. But beyond its spiritual power, Victorian religion held a second, quieter purpose. It reinforced social order with the precision of a well-tuned organ. God watched you. The Crown took notes. To understand the role of religion in Victorian governance, imagine a society where the church pew was as politically charged as the voting booth. The Church of England, as the established church, occupied a privileged position, legally supported, financially intertwined with the state, and expected to model the moral backbone of the empire. Clergymen weren't merely spiritual leaders, they were unofficial deputies in the grand project of shaping obedient citizens. Sunday wasn't just a day of worship, it was a weekly public audit of morality. Attending church demonstrated respectability, discipline, and community belonging. Staying home, unless accompanied by dramatic illness or respectable mourning, suggested something dangerous: independence. A person who skipped services too often risked becoming the subject of neighbourhood analysis. Perhaps they were lazy. Perhaps they doubted. Perhaps they read novels instead of scripture. A detail that could single-handedly launch 3 gossip chains and a concerned visit from the nearest clergyman. But attendance was only the beginning. Sermons taught Victorians not only religious doctrine but proper behaviour, modesty, industriousness, obedience, charity, within limits, self-restraint, and the importance of knowing one's place. Ministers reinforced a worldview in which hierarchy was natural, social roles were divinely sanctioned, and stability was not only patriotic, it was holy. A good Christian was expected to be a good subject. A rebellious subject risked being labelled a rebellious Christian, and no one wanted their moral character examined with that level of enthusiasm. This alignment of crown and church was not accidental. For centuries the monarchy relied on clergy as local representatives of authority, and the Victorians inherited a refined version of this arrangement. In rural areas, the vicar often acted as the social organiser, educator, mediator, counsellor, and sometimes the only literate person within several miles. In towns and cities, urban clergy became moral overseers, distributing advice with the confidence of people who believed every problem, from poverty to drunkenness to social decline, could be resolved with correct prayer and strategic improvement in personal habits. Religious organisations also promoted charitable work, but these efforts often came with moral strings attached. Soup kitchens provided meals but also served sermons. Orphanages offered shelter but expected gratitude, discipline, and ideally tearful conversion experiences. Missionary societies targeted the poor, the working classes, prisoners, sailors, factory girls, and anyone else whose moral state appeared precarious. Charity wasn't just assistance. It was an opportunity to remind recipients that their struggles weren't simply economic but spiritual, and thus required obedience along with aid. The Victorian era was also marked by a wave of religious revivalism, movements that preached energetic faith, strict morality, and the importance of converting as many souls as possible. Evangelical groups travelled across cities urging repentance, discipline, and self-control, sometimes with enough theatrical gusto to make local theatre troupes nervous about the competition. Their message: salvation was available to all, but so was judgment. And judgment was not just divine, it was social. A morally questionable reputation could ruin one's livelihood as quickly as a bad harvest. Yet, for all this alignment with authority, religion also had internal tensions. Rival denominations, Methodists, Baptists, Catholics, Congregationalists, Presbyterians, competed vigorously for membership. Each offered slightly different interpretations of morality and social life. Some challenged the Church of England's dominance, some emphasised personal responsibility, others focused on community, spiritual discipline, or social reform. This diversity created a landscape where religion was not just belief but identity, a badge signalling your values, your politics, your community, and occasionally your breakfast preferences. Despite these differences, Victorian religion shared one common feature: a deep belief in moral surveillance. Parish records tracked births, marriages, deaths, and reputations. Clergy paid attention to who attended services, who missed them, who behaved improperly, who needed guidance, who required intervention, and who should be politely avoided. The Church didn't have police powers, but it possessed the next best thing: influence, and lots of it. This influence extended into the legal sphere as well. Sunday laws restricted business activity. Certain entertainments were banned on the Sabbath. Public drunkenness was prosecuted partly because it offended religious sensibilities. Even education included heavy religious content, not to indoctrinate children into one specific denomination, but to shape them into morally manageable citizens. Scripture wasn't merely taught, it was used as a template for behaviour. Meanwhile, the monarchy benefited enormously from this moral machinery. Queen Victoria was deeply associated with ideas of virtue, family, duty, and Christian morality. Her personal image blended domestic tranquility with regal authority so seamlessly that criticising the crown felt, to some Victorians, like criticising the moral fabric of society itself. The Church reinforced this perception through sermons praising national unity, divine providence, and the Crown's role in safeguarding both. By the end of the century, religion had become one of the most efficient tools of Victorian control, not through force, not through law, but through expectation. It shaped how people spoke, dressed, married, parented, worked, socialised, and understood themselves. It provided a script for daily life, one that millions followed automatically. The Crown didn't need to monitor every citizen. Religion taught citizens to monitor themselves. Victorian England claimed to revere women, celebrated them as moral pillars, domestic angels, paragons of gentleness, the soft light illuminating the hard edges of society. But beneath these flattering metaphors lay an elaborate system of social, legal, and cultural controls designed to keep women precisely where society wanted them, admired but limited, cherished but contained. Victorian culture excelled at praising women so generously that they barely noticed their wings were tied. You were cherished, also restricted. To understand Victorian femininity, imagine being placed on a pedestal so narrow you could not move without falling off. The ideal woman was gentle, self-sacrificing, modest, nurturing, tidy, graceful, morally pure, and, most importantly, stationary. She existed in relation to others, as daughter, wife, mother, moral guide, and domestic stabilizer. Her sphere was the home, and her purpose was to ensure that the empire's emotional labour was performed without complaint. The boundaries of this domestic ideal were reinforced every day, not through chains or guards, but through expectations so omnipresent they became invisible. Girls were raised to emulate selflessness. Storybooks taught them that virtue meant endurance, and endurance meant quiet suffering, preferably while producing embroidery. Etiquette manuals instructed women on everything from posture to laughter to the appropriate emotional response to receiving unwanted advice. The answer was always restrained gratitude. A Victorian woman could be highly educated, provided her education enhanced her moral character rather than her ambitions. She could read, but not too widely, think, but not too boldly, and express opinions, but only if they involved household management or gentle encouragement. Intellectual curiosity outside approved subjects risked accusations of being unfeminine, a term that carried the cultural weight of a social misdemeanour. Marriage was the central institution shaping women's lives. Once married, a woman became, legally speaking, an appendage of her husband. Under the doctrine of coverture, her identity merged with his. She could not own property independently. She could not sign contracts. She could not sue or be sued alone. Her wages legally belonged to her husband, even if he had contributed nothing to earning them beyond not stopping her. The law treated husbands as protectors and wives as dependents, an arrangement the Victorian legal system celebrated as benevolent while quietly ensuring that women remained financially and legally vulnerable. This dependency was framed not as oppression, but as care. A good husband guided his wife. A dutiful wife trusted his decisions. Women were taught that relying on men was not a limitation but a virtue, like having a guardian angel who also controlled your finances. Even upper-class women with wealth found their autonomy shaped by male relatives who managed their estates, investments, and inheritances. They were encouraged to be grateful for such oversight, as if financial competence were a masculine-only organ. Employment opportunities for women were narrow and carefully curated to align with Victorian ideals. Acceptable jobs included teaching, governess work, sewing, factory labour for the working classes, domestic service, and occasionally nursing. Careers requiring authority, public presence, or intellectual independence were discouraged for middle and upper-class women. The idea of a woman managing a business or pursuing law was treated as mildly humorous, like a child insisting on driving a carriage. Even philanthropy, a domain where Victorian women excelled, became a tool of control. Women engaged in charity work praised for their compassion, but discouraged from addressing structural issues that caused poverty. They were encouraged to soothe suffering, not question its origins. A woman who raised funds for the poor was virtuous. A woman who suggested economic reforms was alarming. Social expectations shaped nearly every aspect of women's lives. Clothing, for example, became a system of restriction disguised as elegance. Corsets cinched waists so tightly that fainting became a legitimate hobby. Layers of skirts made running impossible. Gloves limited tactile contact with the world. Fashion ensured women looked delicate enough to justify the claim that they needed protection, and therefore limitation. Public behaviour was also tightly scripted. A woman walking alone risked moral scrutiny. A woman speaking assertively risked scandal. A woman attending a political meeting risked being declared dangerously opinionated. Respectable femininity required constant self-management, a full-time performance of modesty, restraint, and pleasantness. Yet despite these restrictions, women were not passive. They found ways to navigate, bend, and quietly challenge expectations. Some pursued education through correspondence, private tutors, or progressive schools. Others became writers, an acceptable profession if cloaked under initials or pen names. Women participated in reform movements, from abolition to temperance to early suffrage, using accepted roles like charity work as springboards for political influence. They became scientists, researchers, explorers, and professionals in everything but official title. But even these subtle rebellions worked within constraints shaped by Victorian gender, ideology. Women were encouraged to improve society, but from within the boundaries of femininity. They could influence education, charity, health, morality, and family life, but not governance, law, or economics. They were allowed to guide the world morally, as long as they did not attempt to manage it directly. The result was a peculiar contradiction. Victorian women were upheld as the moral backbone of society, while being denied the structural power to influence it. They were trusted to shape children but not policy, to maintain households but not finances, to nurture communities but not govern them. Victorian England perfected a system in which women were constrained so gently that the constraints often felt like courtesies. Their roles were framed as noble, their limitations as protections, their dependence as honour. Victorian England loved to see itself as the confident centre of a vast and glittering empire, cosmopolitan, worldly, and endlessly curious about the wider world. But this curiosity was paired with something else, a deep, well-practiced suspicion of anyone who didn't fit the familiar mould of Britishness. A foreign face, a foreign accent, a foreign habit. Each became a small mystery Victorians felt duty-bound to solve, preferably with raised eyebrows and discreet observation. Different wasn't illegal, it was suspicious. The 19th century was an age of movement. Steamships and railways made long-distance travel easier than ever, and London became one of the world's busiest crossroads. Immigrants, sailors, traders, students, political exiles, artisans and adventurers poured into ports and cities. Some came seeking work, some came fleeing conflict, some came simply because everything in Victorian travel guides sounded vaguely romantic and only slightly inaccurate. Whatever their reason, foreigners entered a society that believed, quite firmly, that identity was tied directly to loyalty. Victorian England didn't have the formal immigration bureaucracy of later centuries, but it had something just as powerful, a culture of constant categorization. People were sorted, judged, and placed into mental filing systems the moment they arrived. Nationality mattered, religion mattered, accent mattered, even clothing mattered. A person could be impeccably polite, but if they wore their hat at a slightly foreign angle, neighbours would whisper theories that lasted months. Suspicion didn't always stem from hostility. Often it grew from confusion. Many Victorians lived in tight-knit communities where everyone knew everyone else, making strangers immediate anomalies. A newcomer walking through a market might be greeted warmly by vendors, then analysed the moment they passed. Who are they? Why are they here? Did anyone check whether they understand how to queue properly? Questions blossomed effortlessly. Certain groups were scrutinised more heavily than others. Irish immigrants who arrived in large numbers to escape poverty and famine faced intense prejudice. They were portrayed as unruly, politically radical, or morally questionable. Accusations that said more about English anxieties than Irish behaviour. Newspapers printed caricatures. Landlords hesitated to rent to them. Employers doubted them. And social observers treated their presence as evidence of a world changing too quickly. Jewish immigrants, many fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe, encountered similar suspicion. Victorian society admired biblical stories but struggled to welcome actual Jewish families into neighbourhoods built on Christian homogeneity. Jewish communities were watched closely for signs of difference. Even harmless cultural practices became fodder for gossip. Simply keeping dietary laws could make a household seem mysterious, which was Victorian code for "we do not understand them, and therefore we worry." Chinese sailors, African students, Caribbean workers, Indian seamen known as lascars, all entered a society fascinated by empire but strangely reluctant to accept the human beings who represented that empire. These individuals were not just watched, they were studied, sometimes with intrusive curiosity, sometimes with patronizing wonder, and sometimes with outright suspicion. Their presence challenged the quiet Victorian assumption that British streets belonged to British subjects alone. Even Europeans were not immune. French visitors were considered charming but untrustworthy. Germans were admired for their discipline yet feared for their intellectual intensity. Italians were welcome for their music and food, but watched for their political activism. Russians were mysterious. Too mysterious, in fact, and widely believed to be in possession of secret plans regardless of whether they actually had any. Underlying all this suspicion was a national anxiety about loyalty. Victorian England imagined itself a stable society surrounded by potential instability. Foreigners represented the unknown, new ideas, new politics, new customs. Authorities worried that outsiders might import radical ideologies, disrupt social harmony, or, worst of all, challenge British authority. Even harmless actions could be interpreted through this lens. A foreign worker gathering with compatriots might simply be sharing a meal, but to cautious observers, they might be plotting a revolution with no chairs. The press contributed to this atmosphere. Newspapers alternated between celebrating Britain's imperial greatness and warning readers that foreign influence could weaken the nation's moral fibre. Reports about foreign communities were often framed around difference: linguistic, religious, cultural. This constant framing trained readers to view foreigners as a separate class of people whose actions required explanation. Yet despite all the watchfulness, Victorian society also relied on foreign labour, skill, and creativity. Immigrants fueled industry, enriched culture, expanded commerce, and introduced culinary innovations far more interesting than the existing British commitment to beige food. Foreign sailors powered global trade. Foreign artisans brought specialised knowledge. Foreign musicians and writers added sparkle to cultural life. Victorian England wanted their contributions, but also wanted to keep them at arm's length. The legal system reflected this tension. Foreigners could live and work in Britain, but with few formal protections. Marrying a foreigner raised eyebrows. Hiring one required justification. Allowing them to rent certain properties demanded trust most landlords did not possess. Even the census, that great Victorian instrument of classification, asked specifically for nationality, as if tracking foreignness itself were an essential part of public order. Social expectations reinforced the divide. Foreigners were expected to adopt British customs quickly. Even if those customs made no sense, they were told to dress appropriately, speak properly, worship respectably, and behave predictably. Failure to assimilate was interpreted not as cultural difference, but as potential threat. Assimilation wasn't optional. It was the price of existing without raising suspicion. By the late 19th century, Victorian England had perfected a peculiar system, welcoming the world with one hand, scrutinising it with the other. Foreigners could build lives, families and futures on British soil, but only while under the steady gaze of a society convinced that difference required monitoring. In Victorian England, being foreign meant being observed, not aggressively, not violently, but persistently. Like an ongoing mystery people felt obligated to solve. Victorian England treated justice not as a private negotiation between the individual and the law, but as a public performance stage for the moral instruction of the entire nation. Courtrooms, prisons, and correctional rituals all functioned as elaborate theatres of deterrence where wrongdoers, or people who had merely annoyed the wrong officials, were displayed as examples of what not to do. You weren't corrected, you were demonstrated. To understand Victorian punishment, imagine a world convinced that shame was not a side effect of justice but one of its most efficient tools. If you committed a crime, society didn't just want to punish you, it wanted to showcase your punishment, preferably with an audience that would gasp, nod solemnly, and then go home feeling morally reinforced. Courtrooms were the first stage of this civic theatre. Trials were open to the public, and people attended them the way modern audiences attend dramatic miniseries, eagerly, regularly, and with snacks. Newspapers reported trials in vivid detail, relishing every scandal, confession, contradiction, and moral downfall. Whether the accused was a pickpocket, a fraudster, a forger, or someone whose crime consisted of infuriating a magistrate, by speaking out of turn, the press treated such cases as opportunities to entertain and instruct. Readers followed trials the way others followed serialized novels. Justice was not simply served, it was narrated. Inside the courtroom, the accused became a kind of actor, one who usually had no training and absolutely terrible lines. Lawyers delivered impassioned speeches, judges offered stern lectures, and spectators murmured in shared judgment. The ritual conveyed a clear message. The law was majestic, eternal, and profoundly unimpressed by excuses. Even minor offences could result in dramatic scoldings from magistrates who treated every trial as a chance to rehearse for an imagined nationwide broadcast. Punishments themselves varied dramatically but always came wrapped in the belief that hardship taught virtue. Imprisonment grew increasingly common in the Victorian era, but prisons were not designed for rehabilitation so much as for introspection, forced, uncomfortable. Introspection in a cold cell with minimal furniture and maximum time to regret decisions. Many prisons adopted the separate system, isolating prisoners in individual cells so complete that silence became both punishment and companion. In theory, solitude encouraged repentance. In practice, it encouraged existential conversations with walls. Other prisons used the silent system, where inmates were allowed to work together but had to do so in complete silence. No talking, no whispering, not even friendly eye contact. Authorities believed that communication might lead to corruption, conspiracy, or, worst of all, camaraderie. Prisoners marched, laboured, and ate in carefully choreographed sequences, behaving like monastic workers in a much less forgiving monastery. Labour inside prisons was intentionally mind-numbing. Prisoners were assigned tasks such as picking oakum, unravelling old rope, turning cranks attached to absolutely nothing, operating treadmills designed to power nothing, or moving cannonballs from one pile to another and back again. The goal wasn't productivity, it was obedience. Repetition broke stubbornness, monotony banished rebellion, and exhaustion softened character. Or at least that was the theory. Victorians adored theories that looked good on paper, and much less good when experienced in person. Flogging and corporal punishment, though slowly falling out of favour, still appeared in Victorian justice, especially for juvenile offenders or those convicted of moral crimes. Authorities considered physical pain a brisk and efficient teacher. A swift lash reminded the offender, and anyone watching, that the body was a perfectly acceptable canvas for moral messages. Public floggings were rare but memorable. The point wasn't to injure, it was to communicate. And speaking of communication, public humiliation remained a staple of Victorian justice, even as older punishments like the stocks vanished. Newspapers gleefully printed names and offences, employers learned of moral lapses, neighbours discussed transgressions, families received sympathetic but curious visits. Shame became the invisible punishment that followed offenders long after their formal sentence ended. A person who committed one small mistake could find themselves trapped in a social purgatory where everyone remembered them just enough to avoid them. Even reformatories, institutions intended to rehabilitate rather than punish, embraced the theatre of moral correction. Young offenders were placed in rigid environments where instructors taught discipline, structure, and an unshakable fear of authority figures. A reformatory was, essentially, a school where every lesson began with a reminder of what happens when one fails to follow rules. Reform was the goal, but control was the method. Underlying all these systems was a Victorian belief that justice must be witnessed to be effective. A punishment unseen was a lesson wasted. A reprimand delivered privately was a deterrent squandered. Public order required public spectacle. Crime had to be displayed, narrated, and ritualistically condemned so that citizens would internalize the message, stay in line, behave properly, and avoid doing anything that might land you in a courtroom performing an unplanned monologue before an unforgiving audience. The effect on society was profound. People began policing their own behaviour not merely to avoid punishment, but to avoid becoming a story. The fear wasn't only of prison or fines, it was of reputation, gossip, and the slow erosion of respectability. Justice didn't just correct wrongdoing, it shaped culture. It taught citizens that a single misstep could turn into a public morality tale. By the end of the Victorian era, the justice system had evolved significantly, introducing more humane reforms, improving prison conditions, and reducing the use of corporal punishment. Yet the essence of Victorian justice remained unchanged. Punishment was not only functional, it was symbolic. It was designed to be seen, interpreted, and discussed. Victorian England did not maintain order through brute force or overwhelming displays of authority. It didn't need to. Instead, it mastered something far more effective: the slow, steady normalization of obedience. Rules didn't feel like rules. They felt like the natural texture of life. Regulations didn't feel imposed. They felt inherited. Control didn't need to announce itself because it had already been woven quietly into the daily habits of millions of people. You stopped resisting because it felt normal. To understand this process, imagine growing up in a society where every structure around you, church, school, family, workplace, street, courtroom, newspaper, and even your own clothing, reinforce the same message. Stability requires cooperation, and cooperation requires obedience. From childhood, Victorians learned that they lived inside a hierarchy, and that hierarchy made the world make sense. You didn't question authority because authority appeared everywhere, offering instructions so consistently that questioning them felt as unnatural as speaking during a church sermon. Psychologists today would call this internalization. Victorians called it good character. Children absorbed obedience through schooling, where timetables ruled the day, silence was a virtue, and standing in straight lines prepared one for the straight lines of adulthood. Factories reinforced the idea with bells, supervisors, and routines that structured every hour. Churches reinforced it by preaching moral duty. Newspapers reinforced it with stories illustrating the dangers of misbehaviour. And families reinforced it by teaching that propriety was the foundation of social acceptance. By adulthood, the average Victorian didn't simply follow rules, they anticipated them. A person might wake, dress, work, socialise and rest, according to patterns they never consciously questioned. The rhythm of life was so standardised that deviation felt uncomfortable, even rebellious. People obeyed because not obeying required creativity they were never encouraged to develop. The Crown understood this perfectly, even if it rarely articulated the strategy. Control did not rely on constant enforcement, because enforcement suggested instability. True control lived quietly inside expectations. A citizen didn't need a policeman's command to stand in line. They stood in line because standing in line was correct. They didn't need a clergyman to warn them about moral behaviour. They already felt guilty for enjoying themselves too much. They didn't need an employer to bark orders. The clock did it for them. The genius of Victorian control was its invisibility. A rule you notice can be resisted. A rule you cannot see becomes part of who you are. Take timekeeping, for example. Once railways standardised clocks, people began shaping their entire days around fixed schedules. The concept of punctuality evolved from courtesy into obligation. Being late wasn't simply inconvenient, it was a moral failure. People regulated themselves because failing to do so felt like betraying the structure that gave life its order. Or consider public behaviour. It didn't require patrol officers to police every street corner. People policed themselves and each other. A citizen who spoke too loudly or behaved too energetically in public spaces received immediate correction through disapproving glances strong enough to wilt flowers. Someone who questioned authority in conversation was gently but firmly redirected towards safer topics such as weather or the Crimean War. Community pressure created a system in which conformity felt like harmony. Domestic life reinforced this atmosphere. A household was expected to run smoothly, efficiently, and respectably. Cleanliness, quietness, modesty, and predictable routines weren't enforced through punishment. They were enforced through pride. A respectable home reflected respectable inhabitants. A family who deviated from norms wasn't just unusual, it risked becoming the subject of well-meaning but relentless neighbourly concern. Even leisure activities reinforced obedience. Parks taught people to move gently. Museums taught them to observe silently. Theatres taught them to sit still. Public lectures taught them to receive information without interrupting. Recreation wasn't chaotic, it was curated. By the time these subtle pressures accumulated, the Victorian citizen had become a masterpiece of self-management. The Crown didn't need to knock on every door or watch every street. People had already absorbed the sense that their behaviour mattered, that order was precious, and that deviation was suspicious. Control worked best when it didn't look like control at all. This normalisation made even sweeping interventions feel natural. When new laws were introduced on health, sanitation, food, travel, or behaviour, citizens often accepted them with little protest. The logic was simple. If the rule existed, it must be necessary. Authority had earned trust not through openness or kindness, but through consistency. The Crown didn't command loudly. It whispered quietly until the whisper sounded like common sense. But internalised obedience came with a psychological cost. Many Victorians lived with a constant undercurrent of self-monitoring. Was their dress proper? Was their behaviour dignified? Did the neighbours approve? Had they adhered to expectations so seamlessly that they blended into the moral wallpaper of society? Self-consciousness became a national pastime. People did not fear punishment, they feared deviation. This internalisation also shaped ambition. Many Victorians didn't dream beyond their prescribed roles because they had spent their lives inside invisible fences. A factory worker might never imagine a life outside labour. A woman might never imagine authority outside the home. A servant might never imagine interacting with high society. The limits placed on them were so deeply entrenched that they felt like truths rather than boundaries. And yet, for all the constraints, many found comfort in predictability. Order made life manageable. Routines made life understandable. Obedience made society feel stable, which in an age of rapid technological, political and economic change was deeply reassuring. It wasn't that Victorians lacked imagination. It was that imagination felt risky in a world held together by rules. By the end of the era, obedience in Victorian England had become so habitual that citizens barely recognised the mechanism shaping them. Control was no longer an external force. It lived quietly inside the mind, guiding choices as naturally as breathing. Victorian England liked to imagine its monarchy as a gentle, unifying presence, an elegant silhouette hovering above the nation like a benevolent cloud made of moral responsibility and tasteful drapery. But the truth was far more intricate. The Crown did not govern people through direct contact, royal commands, or personal intervention. It ruled through a vast, interlocking ecosystem of institutions, habits, expectations, and bureaucratic structures that managed daily life far more efficiently than any monarch could. The crown didn't rule you, the systems did. To the average Victorian citizen, the monarch was distant, not unreachable, but symbolically elevated, floating in the realm of ceremonies, portraits, and reassuring speeches about national destiny. Queen Victoria was many things, beloved, scrutinised, mythologized, but she was not the person deciding whether your chimney needed inspection or whether your child's employer could demand 12-hour shifts. Those decisions were made by the systems beneath her, shaped by decades of reforms, regulations, public offices, committees, boards, and the relentless expansion of the administrative state. The genius of Victorian governance was that its power operated sideways rather than downward. Instead of royal commands, there were laws. Instead of royal punishments, there were courts. Instead of royal decrees, there were committees drafting guidelines thick enough to injure someone if dropped. Instead of a king's personal guards patrolling the streets, there were police officers whose authority derived not from the monarch's sword, but from the regulations printed in their pocketbooks. Systems were the invisible hand steering society, and they grew more complex with every passing decade. Take public health. The Crown did not tell you how to dispose of your waste or where your nearest water pump should be located. But the Sanitary Board did, and the inspectors did, and the local health committee did. Each layer enforced standards on your home and behaviour in ways that felt both impersonal and strangely intimate. The Crown didn't need to appear on your doorstep. A man with a clipboard and a suspicious look could do the job just as effectively. Education worked the same way. Victorian schools were not shaped by royal philosophy, but by parliamentary acts, local boards, inspectors, and teaching manuals that dictated seating arrangements, lesson plans, and the correct moral tone of arithmetic problems. The monarchy championed education as a national ideal, but the mechanism of education, the actual daily shaping of children, was carried out by teachers, administrators, and rules thick enough to use as doorstops. Even morality had become institutional. Churches, charitable organisations, temperance societies, and reform committees functioned as decentralised moral engines, guiding citizens without ever requiring direct royal involvement. The system worked because Victorians accepted these institutions as natural extensions of national virtue. The monarchy gave moral approval. The systems did the work. Workplace regulation followed a similar pattern. The Crown did not personally check factories for compliance or investigate employers who broke labour laws. Instead, inspectors enforced acts written by legislators inspired by reformers. The monarch's name appeared ceremonially at the top of documents, but the practical authority lived in the hands of ordinary officials. If you worked in a factory, your daily life was shaped not by royal intention, but by factory whistles, foremen, wage boards, and local magistrates. The effect of all this was subtle but profound. Victorians felt governed not by a single authority figure but by an intricate web of expectations. Systems replaced commands, structures replaced interventions. The Crown became the distant symbol of order, while the machinery of the state carried out the details. The expansion of bureaucracy made this even more pronounced. Victorian England produced paperwork at a rate matched only by its production of coal and existential anxiety. Records were kept for nearly everything: births, deaths, marriages, housing, work, school attendance, court cases, taxes, licensing, migration, and even moral infractions. Forms regulated behaviour more efficiently than any royal proclamation. A clerk stamping a document could shape a person's options more decisively than a speech from Buckingham Palace. This distance also protected the monarchy. If a policy failed, the Crown was separated from the fallout. If a regulation angered citizens, the blame fell on boards, committees, or Parliament. The monarch remained above the fray, a comforting symbol untouched by the messy realities of governance. Victorians could criticise a tax, an inspector, a law, or a minister, but criticising the crown itself felt unpatriotic, as though blaming the moon for the tides. The brilliance of indirect rule was that it left room for personal loyalty to the monarch, while encouraging obedience to the system. Victorians could adore Queen Victoria, while simultaneously following rules she had never personally read or approved. They lived inside a structure that wore the crown's image like a signature, symbolically meaningful, administratively optional. By the late 19th century, the Victorian state had become a distributed organism. It breathed through institutions, it thought through legislation, it acted through clerks, officers, inspectors, boards, and committees. It disciplined gently, guided firmly, and regulated relentlessly. The monarchy rested at the centre, not as a puppet master pulling strings, but as the emblem printed on top of the machine, and Victorians adapted with remarkable speed. They learned that personal authority was irrelevant. Procedures were what mattered. Systems were predictable. Systems had hours. Systems had guidelines. Systems had appeal processes. A monarch could be appealed to emotionally. A system demanded paperwork. In the end, Victorian control succeeded not because the crown exerted power, but because it distributed power so widely that it no longer needed. 2. Victorian England is often remembered as a world of refinement, lace collars, polished manners, tidy parlours, and novels about long silences between emotionally charged glances. But beneath the surface elegance, ordinary life unfolded inside one of the most intricately regulated societies in modern history. The rules were endless, the expectations unmistakable, and the systems omnipresent. And yet people lived, worked, laughed, cried, courted, raised families, and built futures in the middle of all this dense social machinery. The good news? You survived Victorian England. The bad news? You did it by learning when to stay quiet. Survival required adaptation, not the dramatic kind, like wrestling wolves or escaping burning mansions, but the quieter, more constant skill of navigating authority woven into every corner of existence. Stability was the promise. Freedom was the negotiation. Life in Victorian England meant balancing these forces every day, often without realising the balancing act was happening at all. From the moment you woke, structure awaited you. Clocks dictated your morning. Etiquette dictated your movements. Respectability dictated your clothes. The public eye, represented by neighbours, clergy, employers, inspectors, or simply a stern passerby, dictated your behaviour. People learned early that stepping out of line didn't just bring consequences, it brought attention. And in Victorian society, attention was rarely a blessing, but control was rarely forceful. Instead, it was gentle, persistent, and atmospheric. Laws shaped the environment. Systems shaped routines. Social norms shaped thought. The crown did not hover overhead with a heavy hand. It whispered through institutions, encouraging people to accept the world as it was because the world as it was appeared orderly, familiar, and safe. Yet this safety came at a cost. Personal freedom shrank in proportion to public stability. Victorians lived in a society where your clothes signalled your morality, your posture signalled your upbringing, your silence signalled your respectability, your obedience signalled your worth. You weren't forced into these roles. You were ushered, nudged, and occasionally guilted into them. Over time, many people no longer recognised the nudges. They mistook them for choices. Staying within boundaries felt natural because almost no one could remember life outside them. And still, people found ways to thrive. Despite bureaucracy, they carved out joy in small rituals, tea shared with family, evening walks, whispered gossip, quiet courtships, laughter behind closed doors. Despite moral expectations, they cultivated personal quirks, hobbies, humour, sentimental treasures tucked away in drawers. Despite rigid roles, they built communities that supported one another through hardship, illness, and the unpredictable currents of the industrial age. Victorian life wasn't simply a story of control, it was a story of endurance. People didn't just follow rules, they adapted them, bent them, worked around them when necessary. A society can impose expectations, but individuals will always find pathways between the cracks. And Victorians, creative, stubborn, quietly resilient, found many. At the same time, it is impossible to ignore how deeply the era valued the appearance of order over the experience of freedom. Stability was a triumph, but also a constraint. Progress was astonishing, but tightly supervised. Morality was preached loudly, but often selectively. Choices existed, but they were limited, graded, and quietly monitored. To live in Victorian England meant mastering the art of self-regulation. You learned to speak softly. You learned to dress properly. You learned to move politely. You learned that certain opinions stayed inside your head. You learned that institutions were not to be challenged, only managed. And above all, you learned that survival in such a tightly wound society depended less on rebellion and more on quiet navigation. People rarely rebelled against the system because the system didn't give them a clear surface to push against. Control was distributed so broadly that no single entity appeared responsible. You couldn't point at the Crown and say, "You did this." You couldn't point at the church, the schools, the courts, the newspapers, or the police. They were all fragments of a larger design. So Victorians learned to live inside the structure, shaping their lives around its edges, adapting where they could, submitting where they must, and finding meaning in the spaces the system did not explicitly claim. This was the paradox of Victorian England, a society that achieved remarkable stability, but only by asking individuals to shrink themselves just enough to fit the mould. And yet, people survived with grace, humour, warmth, and astonishing endurance. They built families. They built communities. They built an empire, sometimes proudly, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes without understanding how deeply they had been shaped by the forces that held everything together. In the end, Victorian life offered a bargain, security in exchange for quiet compliance. Not outright silence, but selective silence. The practiced ability to know when to speak, when to whisper, and when to say absolutely nothing because nothing was the safest answer.